They say power is everything in this world, but here's what they don't tell you. Power means nothing when the person you trusted most becomes the blade at your throat. Empress Celine Vale ruled an empire beside a king she thought she knew. She commanded armies, crushed rebellions, and bent kingdoms to her will. But none of that prepared her for the night she followed her husband through secret tunnels and watched her entire life collapse in a single moment. This is the story of a queen who lost everything except the one thing that mattered, her refusal to stay broken. Stick around until the end because this betrayal goes deeper than you think. Hit that like button and drop your city in the comments so I know where my wolf pack is watching from. DC. The storm came without warning, the way storms always did in the northern territories. Rain hammered against the palace windows like fists demanding entry, and somewhere in the east wing, thunder cracked loud enough to rattle the crystal chandeliers Celine had always hated. Too much glitter, too much performance. The kind of thing Darius loved because it reminded everyone who held the power here. Celine stood at the window of her private chambers, staring out at nothing, her reflection ghosting back at her in the glass. 32 years old, and already she looked like someone carved from stone. Sharp cheekbones, dark eyes that used to spark with ambition, now just flat and watchful. Her hair hung loose tonight, black as ink, because she'd sent the servants away hours ago. She didn't want anyone seeing her like this. Waiting. Always waiting. Darius hadn't come to bed in 3 weeks. Not unusual, she told herself. The king had responsibilities. Border skirmishes in the south, trade disputes with the coastal territories, the endless, tedious work of holding an empire together when half the noble houses wanted to tear it apart. She understood duty. She'd built her entire life around it, but understanding and believing were two different animals. She pressed her palm flat against the cold glass and felt her wolf stir beneath her skin, restless and suspicious. Her alpha instincts had been screaming at her for months now, that primal part of her that could smell lies the way humans smelled smoke. Something was wrong. Something had shifted in the palace, in the way guards avoided her eyes, in the way conversations died when she entered rooms, in the careful, neutral expressions everyone wore like masks now. Darius used to touch her when he walked past, used to catch her hand, pull her close, whisper something crude and possessive that made her laugh despite herself. Used to look at her like she was the only thing in any room that mattered. Now he looked through her like she was furniture. The door to her chamber opened without a knock. Celine didn't turn around. She knew that stride, measured and military, boots clicking against marble. Commander Rhys, the only person in this entire cursed palace she still halfway trusted. Rhys, Old Lion, served under 3 kings before Darius, fought in the Western campaigns when Celine was still a child. Silver threading through his dark hair now, scars crossing his knuckles from decades of holding a sword, but his eyes were still sharp, still seeing everything everyone else tried to hide. Rhys stopped 3 paces behind her and said nothing for a long moment. That was his way. Never spoke unless the words mattered. Finally, "Your Majesty." She almost laughed at the title. Majesty, what a joke. "Don't call me that when we're alone, Rhys. You know I hate it. Old habits." He moved closer, standing beside her at the window, looking out at the storm. Rain streaked the glass between them and the dark grounds below. His voice dropped lower. "You should rest. I've been resting for months. Resting, sitting pretty, playing the good quiet wife while my husband—" She bit down on the words before they could finish forming. Even now, even with Rhys, she couldn't quite say it out loud, couldn't make it real. Rhys exhaled slowly through his nose. "I did what you asked. Followed him for 3 nights straight." Celine's chest tightened. "And?" "He leaves through the Eastern Passage. The old one, from the war. Thinks nobody knows about it anymore. Takes 2 guards with him, different ones each time. Always after midnight. Always when the palace is sleeping." "Where does he go?" Rhys hesitated, and that hesitation told her everything she needed to know before he even spoke. "There's an estate, 2 hours north, hidden in the pine forests. Used to belong to House Merrick before they fell. Empty for years. Or it was supposed to be." Celine turned to look at him fully now, her wolf rising closer to the surface, making her eyes flash gold in the dim light. "Who's there?" "A woman." Rhys's jaw tightened. "Young, beautiful, goes by the name Lyra Voss, though I doubt that's real. She's no servant, no courtesan, Moves like someone trained, talks like someone educated. And the way he looks at her? Don't. Celine's voice came out sharper than she intended. Don't tell me how he looks at her. Rhys went quiet again. The rain filled the silence between them, relentless and cold. Celine's hands curled into fists at her sides, nails biting into her palms. She wanted to scream, wanted to shift and tear through the palace walls until she found Darius and ripped the truth out of his lying throat. But she was an empress. She'd learned a long time ago that rage was a luxury she couldn't afford. Instead, she asked the only question that mattered. How long? Rhys looked at her with something close to pity, which somehow hurt worse than anything else. At least 6 months. Maybe longer. 6 months. 6 months of pretending. 6 months of diplomatic smiles and public appearances and standing beside Darius at state dinners while he played the devoted husband. 6 months of lying in her bed alone while he... She turned away from the window, away from Rhys, pressing her fingers against her temples. Her wolf was snarling now, demanding action, demanding blood. But Celine had survived this long by being smarter than her instincts. I want to see it myself, Your Majesty. Don't argue with me, Rhys. If you're right, if he's really been... She couldn't finish, couldn't force her mouth to form the word. Betraying, cheating, destroying everything they'd built together. Rhys studied her for a long moment, then nodded once. Tonight. He usually leaves around 2 in the morning. I'll have horses ready at the north gate. Not horses, too obvious. We walk. That's 4 hours through the forest in a storm. Then we'd better leave soon. Rhys didn't argue. He knew her too well for that. Just inclined his head and moved toward the door, then paused. My lady, whatever we find there, I know. Her voice was steady now, cold as the rain outside. I know exactly what we'll find. After Rhys left, Celine stood alone in her chambers, staring at her reflection in the darkened window. The woman looking back at her was a stranger. Someone carved from ice and duty and all the years of pretending everything was fine when nothing had been fine for a very long time. She'd married Darius Thorne when she was 19 years old, a political alliance that became something else, something real, or so she'd thought. He was everything an alpha king should be, strong, commanding, ruthless when necessary, but with a streak of dark humor that caught her off guard. He'd courted her like she was prey, circling closer and closer until she couldn't remember why she'd ever wanted to run. Their wedding had been the event of the century. 2 of the most powerful bloodlines in the empire finally united. The kingdom celebrated for 3 days straight. Celine had worn white silk and silver coronet and stood before thousands, speaking vows she'd meant with every fiber of her being. Till death, they'd promised each other. Till the end of everything. She'd believed him. She'd believed every word. Celine turned from the window and moved through her chambers like a ghost, stripping out of her formal gown, pulling on hunting leather she hadn't worn in years. Dark clothing, practical and silent. She braided her hair back tight, splashed cold water on her face, stared at herself in the mirror one last time. The Empress was gone. The woman left behind was someone harder, someone who could do what needed doing. She armed herself quietly, silver dagger at her hip, another strapped to her thigh. Not because she planned to use them, because she needed to feel like she had some control over what was coming. At 1:15, she slipped out of her chambers through the servants' entrance, moving through the palace corridors like she was made of shadow. Decades of living here meant she knew every passage, every hidden route, every place the guards didn't watch quite carefully enough. The palace was different at night, colder. All the performance stripped away, leaving just stone and silence and the ghosts of 1,000 years of history pressing down from above. How many other queens had walked these halls with their hearts breaking? How many other women had discovered too late that the man they loved was a beautiful lie? Rhys met her at the north gate, already waiting, dressed in dark traveling clothes with his sword strapped across his back. He didn't say anything, just nodded once, and they moved out into the storm together. The rain was brutal, soaking them both within minutes, turning the ground to mud under their feet. Celine kept her head down and pushed forward, following Rhys through the forest paths he knew better than anyone. 4 hours, he'd said. 4 hours to walk to her husband's secret and see her entire world end. They didn't talk, nothing to say. Rhys led and Celine followed, her wolf prowling just beneath her skin, ready for violence, ready for anything except the truth she already knew was waiting. The forest grew thicker as they moved north, pine trees crowding close, their branches whispering overhead. Twice they had to stop and hide as royal guards passed nearby, patrolling routes that shouldn't have existed out here. More proof. More confirmation of everything Celine didn't want to believe. Around 3:30 in the morning, Reese held up a hand and they both stopped, crouching low behind a fallen log. Through the rain and darkness, Celine could just make out lights ahead. A building, tucked away in a small clearing, large enough to be called a manor, but modest compared to the palace. Warm light glowed from the windows on the second floor. Someone was home. Someone was waiting. Reese leaned close, his voice barely audible over the rain. The guards usually patrol the perimeter. 2 of them. Rotating shifts. We can get closer through the east side. There's a gap in their pattern. Celine nodded, not trusting her voice. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, her wolf snarling and clawing, wanting to charge forward, wanting to tear down the door and face whatever was inside. But she forced herself to stay still, to wait, to be smart about this. They moved carefully around the edge of the clearing, using the trees for cover, staying low and silent. Celine's training kicked in, all those years of learning to move like a predator, to hunt without being seen. Strange how those skills came back when you needed them most. They reached the side of the manor unseen. Up close, Celine could see it was well-maintained, recently renovated. New shutters, fresh paint, expensive glass in the windows. Someone had put money into this place. Someone had been planning this for a while. Reese found a window on the ground floor, partially open, probably for ventilation. He looked at Celine, asking permission without words. She nodded. They climbed through together, landing quietly in what looked like a study. Books lining the walls, a desk covered in papers, a fire dying in the hearth. Everything tasteful and expensive and secret. Voices drifted down from upstairs. A man's laugh, deep and familiar. Celine's entire body went rigid. Darius. Her husband's voice, relaxed and genuine in a way she hadn't heard in months. Happy, like he'd finally come home. And then another voice, female, warm and intimate. You can't keep disappearing like this. People will notice eventually. Let them notice. Darius again, closer now, like he was moving across a room upstairs. I'm done pretending. Done playing the devoted husband to someone who stopped caring years ago. Celine's knees almost buckled. She grabbed the edge of the desk to steady herself, her vision tunneling, her wolf howling inside her skull. Reese grabbed her arm, keeping her upright, his grip tight and grounding. The woman's voice continued. And Celine, what happens when she finds out? Celine won't find out. She's too busy playing Empress, too concerned with appearances to notice what's happening right under her nose. Besides, after tomorrow, it won't matter. Darius's voice hardened. Once the council meeting is over, once the Northern Territories pledge their support, we'll have everything we need. The noble houses, the military, the leverage. She'll have no choice but to step aside quietly. And if she doesn't? A pause. Then Darius, cold as winter. Then we'll make her. The woman laughed softly. You're terrible. No, I'm finally free. Celine stood frozen in the study below, every word hitting like physical blows. Not just an affair, not just betrayal, a conspiracy, a coup. Her own husband plotting to strip her of everything, to remove her from power, to destroy her completely. And she'd suspected nothing until it was almost too late. Reese was pulling at her arm, whispering urgently that they needed to leave, needed to get out before someone discovered them. But Celine couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The woman she'd been when she entered this house was gone, burned away by her husband's words, leaving behind something else, something colder, something dangerous. Upstairs, footsteps moved across the floor. Darius, still talking. The council meeting is set for the Moon Festival. Public, ceremonial, impossible for her to refuse to attend. That's when we'll make the accusation. Treason, corruption, whatever we need. The noble houses are already convinced. They've been waiting for an excuse to remove her for years. Why? The woman's voice was curious. What did she do that made them hate her so much? She's too strong, too independent. They wanted a decorative wife for me, someone manageable. Instead, they got an empress who actually thought she had power. Darius laughed, and the sound made Celine's stomach turn. They've been looking for a way to cut her down since the wedding. I'm just finally giving them one. Celine turned and walked out of the study, moving through the manor like a ghost, Reese following close behind. They climbed back through the window, back into the rain, back into the forest. She didn't run, didn't let herself break down, just walked steadily through the storm, her mind racing, already planning, already 3 steps ahead. By the time they reached the palace, dawn was breaking gray and cold over the eastern mountains. Celine stopped at the north gate, turned to Reese, and when she spoke, her voice was steady as stone. "Gather everyone you trust. I need names, numbers, people who are loyal to the crown, not just to the king. I need to know who can be turned and who needs to be removed." Reese studied her face, and whatever he saw there made him nod slowly. "You're going to fight. I'm going to win." She met his eyes, her wolf burning gold behind her gaze. "Darius thinks I'm weak, thinks I'll step aside quietly. He's about to learn exactly who he married." "And if you can't win?" Celine smiled, and there was nothing soft in it. "Then I'll burn this entire kingdom down before I let him take it from me." She walked back into the palace alone, through the servants' entrance, through the empty corridors, back to her chambers where everything looked exactly the same as when she'd left. But everything had changed. The woman who'd stood at this window last night, waiting and hoping and lying to herself, was dead. The woman who remained was something else entirely. Celine stripped out of her wet clothes, washed the mud from her skin, pulled on a formal gown of deep crimson, the color of house veil, the color of blood. She braided her hair in the traditional style of ruling empresses, fixed her coronet in place, looked at herself in the mirror. Perfect. Controlled. Exactly what everyone expected to see. Let them keep expecting it. She had work to do. The throne room was already filling with courtiers when Celine arrived for the morning session. She glided in like she always did, regal and untouchable, taking her place on the smaller throne beside Darius's empty seat. He'd arrived late, like he always did these days, making an entrance. Celine watched them all with new eyes now. The nobles, the advisors, the hangers-on who orbited power like moths around flame. Which ones were loyal to Darius? Which ones had been bought? Which ones were part of the conspiracy to destroy her? She'd find out. She'd find out everything. An hour later, Darius finally swept into the throne room with his usual commanding presence, all sharp edges and controlled power. He looked tired, she noticed. Shadows under his eyes. Good. She hoped he hadn't slept well. He barely glanced at her as he took his throne, just a brief nod like she was some minor functionary. The insult was deliberate. Everyone in the room saw it. Celine smiled blandly and said nothing. The morning session dragged through the usual tedious business, land disputes, trade agreements, petitions from the territories. Celine played her part perfectly. The supportive wife, offering counsel when asked, staying silent when not. All the while, her mind was racing, cataloging every exchange, every glance, every moment of hesitation that might reveal who stood where. When the session finally ended and the throne room emptied, Darius stood and walked out without a word to her. Just left her sitting there like she was part of the furniture. Perfect. Celine rose gracefully and made her way through the palace to the east wing, to a set of chambers that had belonged to Caelan Thorne once upon a time, Darius's younger brother, the spare heir, the one they'd exiled 3 years ago after some political scandal Celine had never fully understood because Darius had insisted it was family business and she'd trusted him. She didn't trust him anymore. The chambers were sealed, gathering dust, but Celine had keys to every room in this palace. She let herself in quietly and began searching through the papers Caelan had left behind, looking for anything, any clue about what had really happened. 3 hours later, she found it. Letters. Dozens of them. Between Caelan and various noble houses, discussing concerns about Darius's increasing instability, his secret meetings, his growing paranoia. Caelan had been investigating his own brother, had been building a case to present to the royal council, and Darius had discovered it and destroyed him before he could act. Celine sat back on her heels in the dusty study, staring at the evidence scattered around her. Caelan hadn't been guilty of treason. He'd been guilty of seeing the truth too early. She gathered the letters carefully, hiding them in the folds of her gown. Caelan. She needed to find him, needed to bring him back, because if anyone would understand what she was facing, it would be him. That night, Celine hosted a small dinner party, as she often did. Harmless socializing, she'd told Darius. Building relationships with the noble houses. He'd barely listened, just waved her off like he was granting permission to a child. But the guest list was very carefully curated. Lords and ladies from the old houses, the ones who'd been powerful before Darius's family rose to prominence. The ones who remembered when the empire was built on honor instead of fear. The ones who had children and grandchildren and reasons to care about the kingdom's future. Celine played hostess with her usual grace, pouring wine and making small talk and laughing at jokes she didn't find funny. But she was also watching, listening, testing carefully chosen words to see how they landed. By the end of the evening, she had 3 houses she thought might listen, 3 threads she could pull. It was a start. Over the next 2 weeks, Celine moved through the palace like she was dancing on the edge of a knife. By day, she played the perfect Empress, attending ceremonies and state functions, and standing beside Darius while he made speeches about unity and strength. By night, she met with Rhys and a growing network of allies, quietly building the case against her husband. She discovered that Lara Voss wasn't just Darius's mistress. She was connected to House Voss, one of the rival clans from the Western Territories, families who'd been trying to undermine the crown for generations. The affair wasn't a weakness. It was strategy. She discovered that funds had been disappearing from the royal treasury, funneled to accounts in the territories that had pledged support to Darius's coup. Buying loyalty, buying silence. She discovered that 3 members of the royal guard had been replaced in the last year with men loyal to Darius alone. Men who would follow orders without question. Men who would kill an empress if their king commanded it. Every discovery made her colder. Every piece of evidence added to the growing certainty that this wasn't just betrayal. This was war. And Celine had never lost a war. The Moon Festival approached with terrible inevitability. The biggest celebration of the year, when all the noble houses gathered in the capital for 3 days of ceremony and feasting and political maneuvering. The throne room would be packed. Every eye in the kingdom would be watching. The perfect stage for Darius to destroy her. The perfect stage for her to destroy him first. 3 nights before the festival, Celine finally made contact with Kalen. He was living in exile in the Southern Territories, running a small trading company under an assumed name. When he received her letter, he responded within hours. His message was brief. "I always knew you'd see through him eventually. Tell me what you need." She told him everything. 2 nights before the festival, Darius came to her chambers for the first time in a month. Celine was sitting at her desk, reading reports, and looked up in genuine surprise when he walked in. He looked terrible, exhausted, older somehow, like the weight of whatever he was planning had finally started crushing him. For a moment, just a moment, Celine felt something close to pity. Then she remembered his voice in that hidden manner, talking about removing her, and the pity vanished. "Darius." She kept her voice neutral. "This is unexpected." He poured himself a drink from her cabinet, not asking permission, just taking like he always did. "We need to talk." "All right." He drank, staring at the fire in her hearth. "The Moon Festival. I need you to be visible, engaged. Play the devoted wife one more time." Celine set down her papers carefully. "Of course, whatever you need." Darius turned to look at her, and there was something in his expression she couldn't quite read. Guilt, maybe. Or just exhaustion. "You've been a good empress, Celine. I want you to know that. Whatever happens, you served the kingdom well." Her blood turned to ice. This was it. The moment before everything broke open. She stood slowly, moving closer to him. "Whatever happens?" That sounds ominous. Darius's jaw tightened. "Things are changing. The council has concerns. There will be discussions during the festival. Accusations, maybe. I need you to stay calm. Trust that I'm handling it." He was warning her, giving her a chance to surrender quietly. Probably thought he was being merciful. Celine reached out and touched his arm, gentle and trusting, exactly like the wife he thought she was. "I trust you completely, Darius. I always have." He looked at her for a long moment, and something flickered in his eyes. Regret, maybe. Or just relief that she was making this easy. Then he left, taking his drink with him, leaving her alone in her chambers. Celine stood frozen until his footsteps faded down the corridor. Then she moved to her desk, pulled out parchment and ink, and began writing letters. To Kalen, to Rhys, to every ally she'd cultivated in the last 2 weeks. The festival began in 2 days. She had 48 hours to prepare for war. The morning of the Moon Festival dawned clear and cold. The kind of perfect autumn day that made the entire capital city look like something out of a painting. Banners hung from every building, silver and blue for the royal house, and the streets filled with crowds dressed in their finest, ready to celebrate. Celine dressed with care, choosing a gown of midnight blue silk embroidered with silver wolves, her house sigil. She wore every piece of formal jewelry she owned, crown and necklace and rings, the full armor of an empress. When she looked in the mirror, she saw exactly what she needed to see: power, control, someone who would not break easily. The throne room was packed when she arrived, every noble house in the kingdom crammed into the massive space, all of them dressed like they were going to war themselves, which they were, in a way. Politics was always war by another name. Celine took her place on her throne and waited. Darius arrived 10 minutes later with his full retinue, looking every inch the Alpha King. But Celine noticed the guards flanking him were the new ones, the loyal ones. And she noticed Lyra Voss standing in the crowd, dressed as a guest from House Voss, perfectly positioned to watch everything unfold. So that's how he was playing it. The ceremony began with the usual speeches, the usual pageantry. Celine barely heard any of it. She was too busy watching the crowd, tracking every face, every movement, waiting for the moment Darius would strike. It came 2 hours in. Darius stood from his throne and raised his hand for silence. The throne room went quiet instantly, hundreds of faces turning toward him with anticipation. "My friends, my people." Darius's voice rang out strong and commanding. "We gather here today to celebrate our strength, our unity, our empire. But I stand before you with a heavy heart, because I have learned something that threatens everything we've built, something that breaks my heart even as I speak it. Here it comes." Celine kept her face perfectly neutral, her hands folded in her lap, the picture of composure. Darius turned to look at her, and there was nothing in his expression now. No regret, no guilt, just cold calculation. Empress Celine Vale stands accused of treason against the crown. Gasps echoed through the throne room. Nobles turned to stare at Celine, shock and speculation written across their faces. Celine didn't move, didn't react, just sat perfectly still and let the chaos build around her. Darius continued, pulling papers from his jacket. Evidence has come to light of secret dealings with rival kingdoms. Funds stolen from our treasury, plots to undermine the royal council and seize power for herself. He looked at her again. I wanted to believe it was lies. Wanted to trust the woman I married. But the proof is undeniable. He held up the papers like they meant something, like they were real. The bastard had forged evidence, had built his case carefully, probably over months, making sure it would stick. Celine finally spoke, her voice carrying across the silent throne room. May I see this evidence? Darius hesitated, just for a moment. Then he gestured for a guard to bring the papers to her. Celine took them calmly, reading through page after page of careful forgeries. Letters supposedly in her handwriting, financial records showing transfers to foreign accounts, witness statements from servants who'd supposedly seen her conspiring with enemies of the crown. It was good work, convincing. If she didn't know better, she might have believed it herself. She set the papers down carefully and looked up at Darius. These are lies. The council will determine that. Darius gestured, and suddenly guards were moving forward, surrounding her throne. You will surrender your title and submit to investigation. If you're innocent, you have nothing to fear. And if I refuse, then you'll be removed by force. His voice was hard now. I'm trying to give you dignity, Celine. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Celine stood slowly, her movements graceful and controlled. Every eye in the throne room was locked on her. This was the moment. The precipice. Everything she'd built in the last 2 weeks came down to the next 60 seconds. She smiled. Then she pulled her own papers from the folds of her gown and held them up for everyone to see. Before we discuss my alleged crimes, perhaps we should discuss yours. Darius went very still. Lyra Voss, standing in the crowd, had gone pale. Celine's voice rang out clear and strong. You accuse me of stealing from the treasury, but these records show 3 million in gold transferred to accounts controlled by House Voss over the last 18 months. You accuse me of secret dealings, but these letters detail your meetings with rival alphas, promising them territory and titles in exchange for supporting a coup against the royal council. You accuse me of treason. She stepped down from her throne, walking toward him, papers held high. But it was you. It was always you, building your secret alliance, buying loyalty with stolen gold, planning to remove me from power so you could rule without challenge. She stopped 3 paces from him. And you made one fatal mistake, Darius. You underestimated me. The throne room exploded into chaos. And somewhere in the noise and the shock and the beautiful, terrible moment of everything breaking open, Celine felt her wolf finally bare its teeth and smile. The throne room didn't just go silent, it went dead. That particular kind of quiet that happens when hundreds of people stop breathing at the same time because their brains can't process what they just heard fast enough to form words. Celine held the papers higher, letting every noble in that room see them, letting the weight of what she just said sink in like a blade between ribs. She could feel their shock rolling toward her in waves, could smell the fear starting to replace the certainty they'd walked in with. They'd come here expecting to watch a queen fall. Instead, they were watching an empire crack open. Darius hadn't moved. He stood frozen 3 paces from her throne, his face locked in that expression powerful men wear when they realize for the first time that they've miscalculated. Not anger yet, not defense, just the stunned recognition that the trap they'd built so carefully had somehow closed around them instead. Celine took another step toward him, slow and deliberate, her wolf prowling just beneath her skin. Her voice carried across the silent hall like a blade scraping stone. House Voss received $3.2 million in gold from our treasury over 18 months. The records are here, signed by your personal chamberlain. Her fingers tapped the papers. The Northern Territories pledged their military support in exchange for mineral rights and tax exemptions you had no authority to promise. Those letters are here too, and the estate in the pine forest where you've been spending your nights, the one registered under a shell company traced back to accounts you personally control. I have the deeds, the financial transfers, everything. She was 3 feet from him now, close enough to see the muscle jumping in his jaw, close enough to watch his pupils dilate with the first real flash of fear. You built this conspiracy for over a year, Darius, bought loyalty, forged alliances, convinced half the noble houses that I was the threat to stability when it was you all along. Her voice dropped lower, intimate and vicious. You were good. I'll give you that. You almost pulled it off. Darius's hands curled into fists at his sides. His wolf was rising. She could see it in the gold starting to bleed into his eyes, the way his shoulders tensed like he was preparing to shift. Dangerous. Cornered animals always were. But she'd been counting on that. Those papers are forgeries, Darius said, and his voice was still trying for authority, still reaching for the command that usually bent rooms full of people to his will. Lies manufactured by a desperate woman trying to save herself. Then explain the witnesses. Celine gestured toward the crowd, and on cue, 3 figures stepped forward. Minor nobles, carefully chosen, people whose testimony couldn't be easily dismissed. They will testify to the council about the meetings, the promises, the gold-changing hands. She smiled, cold and sharp. I've been investigating you for 2 weeks, husband. Every move you made, I documented. Every ally you bought, I tracked. Every secret you thought was buried, I dug up and brought into the light. The throne room was coming alive again, whispers spreading like wildfire through the crowd. Celine could see the noble houses starting to fracture, could watch the careful alliances Darius had built beginning to crumble as people recalculated their positions and their loyalties. This was how power really shifted, not with swords, with doubt. Darius took a step toward her and his voice came out harder now, all pretense of civility stripped away. You have no authority to make these accusations. You're not the crown. You're just the wife. And there it was, the truth he'd been hiding behind diplomatic language and careful performance for years. She was just the wife, just the decoration, just the womb that was supposed to produce heirs and the face that was supposed to smile and wave and never question anything. Celine felt something cold and bright crystallize in her chest. Not rage. Rage was hot and sloppy and stupid. This was clarity. You're right, she said softly. I'm not the crown, but I am the one holding evidence of your treason. And in about 30 seconds, you're going to understand exactly what that means. She turned away from him, addressing the room, projecting her voice to reach every corner of the throne hall. The Moon Festival is suspended. The Royal Council will convene immediately to hear the charges against King Darius Thorn, Until that time, he will surrender his seal and submit to house confinement. You can't do that. Darius's voice cracked on the words. You don't have the authority. Selene gestured, and Rhys stepped forward from his position along the wall. Behind him came 12 royal guards, the ones who'd been in the palace longer than Darius had been king, the ones whose loyalty ran to the crown itself instead of whoever was wearing it. Commander Rhys has authority in matters of royal security. And right now, you're a security threat. Selene looked back at Darius, and she let him see everything in her eyes now. All the nights she'd waited, all the lies she'd swallowed, all the ways he'd made her small. This is me taking it back. Darius moved fast, faster than she'd expected. His hand went to the sword at his hip, drawing steel with the fluid precision of someone who'd spent 40 years learning how to kill. And suddenly, the air pressure in the throne room changed as half the guards reached for their own weapons. But Selene didn't flinch. She stood perfectly still and let him point that blade at her throat, while 300 people held their breath and waited to see if their king would actually murder his wife in front of the entire kingdom. Go ahead, she said quietly. Kill me right here. Prove every word I just said about you. Make yourself a kingslayer and a wife murderer in one stroke. Her eyes locked on his. See how many houses still support you after that? The blade didn't waver. Darius's hand was steady, but Selene could see the calculation racing behind his eyes, could watch him trying to find a path forward that didn't end with him destroying himself completely. There wasn't one. He'd built his trap too carefully, and now he was standing in it. The standoff lasted maybe 10 seconds, maybe 100 years. Time did strange things when you were staring at your own death held by someone who'd once promised to love you forever. Then Lyra Voss's voice cut through the silence from somewhere in the crowd. Darius, don't. And that was the moment Selene won, because every head in the room turned toward that voice. Every noble who'd been watching the drama suddenly zeroed in on the young woman standing among the House Voss delegation, her face pale, her hands clenched at her sides. The woman who'd just spoken with the intimacy of someone who had the right to give the king orders. The woman everyone now recognized as exactly what Selene had accused her of being, the king's mistress. Darius's sword arm dropped half an inch. Just enough. Just that tiny fractional moment of distraction. Rhys moved. 1 second he was standing 10 feet away. The next he was between Selene and Darius, his own blade out and crossed against the king's, forcing it away from her throat. 4 more guards closed in, surrounding Darius, weapons drawn but not yet attacking, giving him one last chance to surrender with whatever dignity he had left. Stand down, your majesty. Rhys's voice was flat, professional, completely devoid of the emotion that had to be churning underneath. This can end peacefully. Make the right choice. Darius looked at Rhys, looked at the guards, looked at Selene standing behind them all, untouchable now, protected by the very military he'd thought he controlled. Then he dropped his sword. The clatter of steel on marble echoed through the throne room like a funeral bell. Rhys stepped forward, picking up the blade, gesturing for the guards to flank the king. Darius Thorne, you are confined to the royal quarters pending investigation by the council. You will surrender all seals of office and relinquish command of the royal guard. Do you understand these terms? Darius didn't answer. He was staring at Selene with something that looked almost like respect, or maybe just pure hatred. Hard to tell the difference sometimes. You planned this, he said quietly. All of it. The perfect victim. The wronged wife. You manipulated this entire situation. No. Selene met his eyes without flinching. You planned this. I just refused to die quietly. The guards led him away. 300 nobles watched in stunned silence as their alpha king was escorted out of his own throne room like a criminal, stripped of his power, his dignity, everything that had made him untouchable just 10 minutes ago. Selene waited until he was gone. Then she turned back to face the room, her gown swirling around her like blood in water, her crown still perfectly straight on her head. The council will convene in 1 hour. Until then, everyone is dismissed. Nobody moved at first. They were all still processing, still trying to figure out what world they were living in now that everything had shifted. Then slowly, like ice breaking up in spring, the crowd began to fracture and flow toward the exits. Nobles clustered in tight groups, already arguing, already choosing sides. Selene stood alone in the center of the throne room and felt the weight of what she'd just done settle across her shoulders like a physical thing. She'd declared war on her own husband, on half the noble houses, on the entire power structure that held the empire together. And she'd done it in front of everyone, burning every bridge, cutting off every path of retreat. There was no going back now. The realization should have terrified her. Instead, it felt like the first deep breath she'd taken in years. Lady Celine, a voice from behind her, careful and deferential. One of the minor nobles who'd testified for her, a thin man with clever eyes named Lord Garrett. His house was small but old, the kind of family that survived by being useful instead of powerful. You'll need support. The houses are going to fracture over this. I know. My family pledges to you. Whatever you need. He hesitated. But you should know, at least 6 major houses left with Darius's guards. They're not going to accept this quietly. Let them leave. Celine turned to face him fully. Anyone who stands with a traitor has declared themselves. Better to know now than later. Garrett nodded slowly, but she could see the worry in his eyes. Civil war. That's what you're risking. No! Celine's voice was hard as stone. Darius risked civil war when he decided to betray the crown. I'm just making sure he loses. She dismissed Garrett and made her way through the palace corridors toward the council chambers. Rhys fell into step beside her halfway there, appearing from a side passage like he'd been waiting. The king is secured. Rhys kept his voice low. 20 guards on rotation. He won't leave those quarters without my knowledge. Good. Celine didn't slow her pace. What about Lyra Voss? Gone. She fled as soon as the room cleared, took 3 servants from House Voss with her. They had horses waiting. Smart. Celine felt a flicker of something almost like admiration. The woman knew when to run. Find her anyway. I want to know where she goes, who she talks to. She might be more useful alive than dead. Understood. Rhys paused, then, you should know. Kaelin arrived an hour ago. He's waiting in the Eastern Tower. Celine stopped walking. Kaelin, Darius's brother, the spare heir, the one they'd exiled 3 years ago on trumped-up charges that Celine now understood were just Darius eliminating threats before they could see too much. She'd brought him back into this deliberately, calculated risk. Because if she was going to tear down a king, she needed someone who understood how kingdoms fell. Take me to him. The Eastern Tower was one of the oldest parts of the palace, all stone and narrow windows, and the smell of history pressed into the walls. Kaelin was standing at the window when Celine entered, silhouetted against the late afternoon light. He turned as she approached, and she got her first real look at him in 3 years. He'd changed. Not in appearance exactly, though he'd grown a beard and his hair was longer than palace fashion usually allowed. But something in his eyes was different, harder, more careful. Exile had stripped away whatever softness he'd carried before and left someone who understood exactly how quickly safety could disappear. He looked like someone who'd learned to sleep with one eye open. Celine Vale. His voice was rougher than she remembered, like he'd spent 3 years not talking much. Though I suppose it's Your Majesty now. Don't. Celine closed the door behind her. I'm still just the wife who refused to die quietly. Titles are politics, not truth. Kaelin smiled at that, sharp and knowing. You declared war on my brother in front of 300 witnesses. That's not politics, that's revolution. Your brother tried to have me removed from power. I'm just returning the favor. And you want my help finishing what you started. Kaelin moved away from the window, studying her with those careful exile eyes. Because you're smart enough to know that removing Darius isn't enough. You need someone with a claim to legitimacy. Someone the noble houses will accept. His smile went colder. Someone like the spare heir everyone forgot about. Celine held his gaze. I want the truth about what happened 3 years ago. Why Darius really exiled you. What you knew that made you dangerous. Kaelin laughed, short and bitter. I knew he was unstable. Knew he was making alliances with houses that wanted to carve up the empire like a feast. Knew he cared more about power than the kingdom. He shook his head. I tried to warn the council, tried to build support for forcing him into a regency. He found out and destroyed me before I could move. Framed me for embezzlement, had me exiled before I could defend myself. And you never came back. Never fought him. I was one man against a king. Kaelin's voice hardened. What was I supposed to do? Storm the palace with what army? I survived. Waited. Figured eventually he'd make a mistake big enough that someone would stop him. Celine nodded slowly. He made the mistake. I'm stopping him. But I need to know if you're here for revenge or if you're here for the kingdom. Kaelin studied her for a long moment. Then, why can't it be both? Because revenge makes bad policy. Celine stepped closer. I'm not doing this to hurt Darius. I'm doing it because he's a threat to everything we've built. If you're just here to watch your brother burn, you're no use to me. And if I'm here because I think you're the only person strong enough to hold this empire together after everything Darius broke? Kaelin's eyes were steady on hers. What then? Then we talk about what comes next. The council meeting happened in near darkness. Someone had forgotten to light half the lamps in the chamber, or maybe they'd left them dark on purpose, like they all wanted to pretend they couldn't quite see each other's faces while they decided whether to support a queen's coup against her own husband. 12 council members. 6 showed up. The other 6 had apparently decided that discretion was the better part of not getting executed for treason. Celine sat at the head of the table with Kaelin on her right, and Rhys standing behind her like a promise of violence if anyone tried anything stupid. The 6 counselors who'd actually appeared looked nervous. Good. They should be. Lord Chancellor Henrik spoke first, his voice careful and diplomatic in that way politicians used when they were trying not to take a position. Your Majesty, these are serious accusations. The council must investigate thoroughly before any action. The investigation is finished. Celine placed the evidence on the table. Financial records, witness testimony, correspondence proving King Darius conspired with foreign houses to undermine the crown. This isn't a debate. This is a sentencing. You can't remove a sitting king without unanimous council vote. Henrik's hands were shaking slightly. The law is clear. The law is also clear about treason. Celine leaned forward. Darius forfeited his crown the moment he put his own power above the kingdom's stability. We can do this legally, with council approval and proper procedure, or we can do it practically, with the military backing I've already secured and the noble houses who pledged support this afternoon. She let that sit for a moment. Your choice which way this goes. Silence around the table. She could see them calculating, weighing options, trying to figure out which side of history they wanted to be on when the dust settled. Lady Celeste spoke next. An older woman who'd been on the council longer than Celine had been alive. What assurances do we have that this isn't simply a power grab? That you won't become exactly what you accuse Darius of being? None. Celine met her eyes directly. You have my word, and the evidence, and the fact that I'm sitting here asking for council approval instead of just taking what I want. That's all the assurance you get. Celeste smiled slightly at that. At least you're honest. What's the alternative? Celine looked around the table. We leave Darius in power? Wait for him to finish what he started? Let the kingdom fracture because we were too afraid to act? She shook her head. He's already bought half the northern houses. Already promised away territories we can't afford to lose. Every day he stays king, we get weaker. Every day I'm fighting his conspiracy instead of running the empire, we lose ground. This ends now or it ends badly. That's the only choice we actually have. Another silence. Longer this time. Then Lord Garrett, who testified for her in the throne room, nodded once. House Garrett supports the motion to remove King Darius for treason. One by one, the others followed. Some reluctant, some relieved, all of them understanding that the real vote had happened hours ago in that throne room. This was just making it official. When it was finished, Celine had her unanimous vote. She'd just legally removed a king from power. The weight of that settled across her shoulders like armor and chains all at once. Kaelin leaned closer, his voice pitched for her ears only. Now comes the hard part, holding on to it. Celine stood, gathering her papers. I held on to my life when he tried to take that. I can hold on to a kingdom. But she knew he was right. Taking power was the easy part. Keeping it was where most queens died. She spent the next 6 hours in her study with Rhys and Kaelin, planning. Maps spread across every surface, lists of noble houses and their probable loyalties, troop positions, supply lines, all the machinery of empire that needed managing now that she'd broken the command structure that held it together. The northern territories would resist. They'd pledged to Darius, taken his gold, probably signed agreements they'd rather die than break. Celine marked those houses in red on her maps. Threats to be managed or removed. The southern houses would wait and see. They always did. Careful, pragmatic families who survived by never committing until they knew which way the wind was blowing. Yellow on the map. Potential allies if she proved strong enough. The capital families were split. Some had supported Darius openly, fled with him, or pledged loyalty even after his arrest. Others were starting to send quiet messages to Selene, feeling out her position, looking for ways to switch sides without seeming like traitors. It was a mess. The whole empire was a mess. And Selene was standing in the middle of it, holding everything together through sheer willpower and the threat of what would happen if people stopped listening. You need to address the people. Kaelin tapped the map of the capital city. Tomorrow morning, public speech. Show them you're in control, that the empire isn't collapsing, that life goes on. The people don't care who sits on the throne as long as the roads are safe and the taxes aren't too high. Selene rubbed her temples. They'll accept whoever wins. Maybe. Kaelin's voice was careful. But right now they're scared. Their king just got arrested by his own wife. That's the kind of instability that leads to riots, looting, chaos. You need to give them certainty before fear takes over. He wasn't wrong. Selene looked at Rhys. Can you secure the capital? Full military presence, but not oppressive. Just enough to show we're in control. Already done. Rhys had been making quiet notes throughout the conversation. Extra patrols on every major street. Guards at the granaries and water supplies. Anyone tries to start trouble, we shut it down fast. Good. Selene turned back to the maps. What about Darius? Where is he now? Royal quarters, like I said. 20 guards rotating shifts. He hasn't tried to leave, hasn't asked for anything. Just sitting in there like he's waiting for something. Rhys frowned. That worries me. He should be fighting this. Should be raging, demanding lawyers, calling in favors. Instead, he's just quiet. Because he's still planning. Kaelin's voice was dark. My brother doesn't quit. He's in there right now figuring out his next move. And when he makes it, it'll be brutal. Selene stared at the maps until her vision blurred. She needed sleep. Needed to process everything that had happened today, all the ways her life had irrevocably changed in the space of a few hours. But she couldn't afford rest. Not yet. Double the guard on Darius. No visitors except council approved. I want to know everyone who tries to contact him. Done. And find Lyra Voss. I don't care what it takes. She's the key to whatever network he built. Find her. Find the conspiracy. Rhys nodded and left to give orders. Kaelin stayed, watching Selene with those careful eyes. You should rest. He said it gently. You'll be no good to anyone if you collapse. I'll rest when it's finished. It's never finished. That's what you need to understand. Kaelin moved closer, his voice dropping. Power isn't a goal you reach and then relax. It's a thing you hold on to every single day, every single moment, against everyone who wants to take it from you. If you're waiting for a time when you can breathe easy, you're going to die waiting. Selene looked at him, this man who'd lost everything and somehow survived it. Is that what exile taught you? That there's no such thing as safety? Exile taught me that the only person you can really trust is yourself. Everyone else has their own agenda, their own angle. They'll be loyal right up until the moment it costs them something to stay that way. Kaelin's expression was hard. Even me. Even Rhys. We're useful allies, but don't ever forget we're allies because it benefits us. The second that changes, we're gone. Selene wanted to argue, wanted to believe that loyalty meant something, that the bonds she'd built over weeks of careful work were real and not just convenient. But she'd spent the last month watching her husband betray her while smiling to her face. She'd learned the same lesson Kaelin had, just later and more expensively. Trust was a luxury neither of them could afford anymore. I'll remember that, she said quietly. Good. Kaelin moved toward the door, then paused. For what it's worth, I think you'll be better than him. Better than Darius, better than most of the kings who've sat that throne. You've got the ruthlessness and the intelligence. You just need to survive long enough to use them. He left before she could respond. Selene stood alone in her study, surrounded by maps and lists and all the proof of how complicated her life had just become. Through the window, she could see the capital city spreading out below the palace, thousands of lights in the darkness, everyone representing someone whose life depended on her making the right choices. She'd wanted justice, wanted to stop Darius before he destroyed everything. Now she had it, and the weight of an entire empire was crushing her into the ground. Celine closed her eyes and let herself feel it for just a moment. The exhaustion, the fear, the small voice in the back of her head that kept asking what she'd do if this all fell apart, if she'd traded one nightmare for something worse. Then she opened her eyes, straightened her spine, and got back to work. Because Kaylin was right. There was no finish line, no moment when she could declare victory and rest. Just the next problem, and the next, and the endless grinding work of holding power against everyone who wanted to rip it away. Welcome to being queen, she told herself. Now don't die. The speech happened at dawn the next morning in the great plaza outside the palace gates. Thousands of people packed into the space, citizens and nobles and merchants and workers, everyone drawn by the news that had exploded through the capital overnight. The king was arrested. The queen had staged a coup. The empire was on the verge of civil war or revolution or collapse, depending on who you asked. Celine stood on the balcony overlooking the plaza in a gown of pure white, the color of House Vale, the color of the moon they all served. Her crown caught the early light and threw it back like a promise. Below her the crowd was restless, uncertain, scared. She understood that fear, was living inside it herself. But they couldn't see that. They needed to see strength. Celine raised her hands and the plaza gradually quieted, thousands of faces turning up toward her, waiting to hear what came next. She spoke clearly, her voice amplified by the palace acoustics, carrying to every corner of the gathering. 5 days ago, I discovered that King Darius Thorn had been conspiring with foreign houses to undermine the royal council and seize absolute power. He stole from our treasury. He bought loyalty with promises he had no right to make. He betrayed the crown, the empire, and every person standing in this plaza who trusted him to lead. The crowd stirred, whispers spreading like ripples in water. Yesterday, I present proof of his crimes to the royal council. They voted unanimously to remove him from power and place him under arrest pending trial. This was done legally, properly, following every law that governs our kingdom. Her voice hardened. This was not a coup. This was justice. Someone in the crowd shouted, "What happens now? Now we rebuild." Celine looked out across the thousands of faces. The empire doesn't fall because one man betrayed it. It survives because we're stronger than any single leader. The roads will stay safe. The borders will stay secure. Your lives will continue. Nothing changes except the corruption is gone. But something had changed. Everyone knew it. The certainty was broken. The illusion that kings were untouchable was shattered. Celine could see it in their eyes. The fear, the doubt, the question underneath everything else. If a queen could tear down a king, what was safe anymore? She gave them the only answer she had. I will not betray you the way Darius did. I will lead with transparency, with justice, with the understanding that power is earned every single day through right action. She paused. You don't have to trust me yet. Trust is earned too. But I'm asking you to give me the chance to prove I'm worthy of it. The crowd was silent now, listening, weighing. Then someone started clapping, slow at first, hesitant. Then others joined in, the sound building and spreading until the entire plaza was filled with applause. It wasn't enthusiasm, it wasn't love, but it was acceptance. And for now, that was enough. Celine stood on that balcony while the sun rose behind her, and the crowd gradually dispersed, people heading back to their lives, back to work and families and all the normal things that continued no matter who sat on the throne. She'd won the first battle. Now she just had to win every single one that came after. Forever. Rhys found her an hour later in the war room, staring at reports from the northern territories. His face was grim. We have a problem. Celine looked up. Which one? There are so many to choose from. Darius escaped. The world stopped. Celine stood slowly, her wolf surging to the surface, gold flooding into her eyes. Explain that. 2 hours ago. During the guard change, someone drugged the relief shift, killed 3 guards, got him out through the same tunnel system he'd been using for months. Rhys's voice was flat, professional, but she could see the rage underneath. It was planned, coordinated. He had help from inside the palace. The room tilted sideways for just a second before Celine forced it back into focus. Darius was loose, armed, dangerous, and absolutely committed to destroying her now. Where did he go? North. We tracked him to the forest road before we lost the trail. Rhys handed her a report. 3 other nobles went missing at the same time, houses that pledged to him, and 17 palace guards are unaccounted for. He didn't just escape, he took his private army with him. Celine read the report with hands that wanted to shake but didn't because she wouldn't let them. Darius was building his base, gathering forces, preparing for open war. This wasn't over. It had barely started. She looked up at Kaelin, who'd been standing silent in the corner throughout the exchange. "Your brother just turned this into a real fight." Kaelin nodded slowly. "He was always going to. You can't remove a man like Darius without him burning everything down trying to take it back. The only question was whether he'd do it from prison or from outside. Now we know." Celine turned back to the maps. She found the northern territories, traced the probable routes Darius would take, calculated where he'd go to build support. "Rhys, mobilize the army. I want every garrison on alert, every road north under watch. If Darius is building his forces, I want to know exactly where and how strong." "Done." Kaelin, "You know your brother better than anyone. Where does he go when he's desperate?" Kaelin studied the map for a long moment. "House Merrick, the estate in the pine forest where he was meeting Lyra. That's his stronghold. That's where he'll make his stand. Then that's where we end this." Celine's voice was cold as winter. "I'm not waiting for him to raise an army and march on the capital. We take the fight to him. We end this before it becomes a civil war that tears the empire apart." "You're talking about hunting a king." Rhys's voice was careful. "That's not an arrest. That's an execution." Celine met his eyes and let him see exactly what she'd become in the last 24 hours. "I'm talking about stopping a traitor before he destroys everything I just fought to save. Call it whatever you want. Just help me do it." Rhys nodded once. "Understood." The war room fell silent except for the scratch of pen on paper as they began planning. 3 people against an empire's worth of chaos, trying to hold together something that wanted desperately to fly apart. Celine looked down at the map, at all the red marks indicating threats, all the uncertain territories that could go either way, all the tiny decisions that would determine whether the empire survived or collapsed into violence. She'd started this fight to save herself. Now she was fighting to save everything. And somewhere in the northern forest, Darius was planning his revenge. The point of no return had just disappeared behind her like a door slamming shut. There was only forward now, only winning or dying, nothing else left. The northern road was mud and ice, and the kind of cold that settled into your bones and refused to leave. Celine rode at the head of a column of 200 soldiers, the best fighters Rhys could pull together on 12 hours' notice, all of them grim-faced and silent because they understood exactly what they were riding toward. War with their own king. Former king, Celine reminded herself. Darius had forfeited that title the moment he'd put conspiracy above kingdom. But titles were just words. The man was still dangerous, still commanded loyalty from houses that cared more about power than law, still had enough rage and desperation to burn the entire empire down if it meant taking her with it. The forest closed in around them as they pushed north, pine trees thick enough to block out most of the weak winter sun. 3 days of hard riding, and they were deep in territory that belonged to House Merrick on the maps, but hadn't really belonged to anyone since the civil wars 50 years back. Abandoned land. Perfect for hiding an army. Perfect for an ambush. Rhys rode up beside her, his horse's breath coming out in white plumes. Scouts report movement 2 miles ahead. Camp smoke, probably 50 men, maybe more. Could be Darius. Could be bandits taking advantage of the chaos. Only one way to find out. Celine kept her voice steady even though her wolf was prowling just beneath her skin, tense and ready for violence. "We approach carefully. I want eyes on that camp before we commit." Rhys nodded and fell back to give orders. Celine rode in silence, watching the forest, cataloging every shadow that could hide an enemy. She'd spent 3 days preparing for this moment. 3 days drilling the soldiers, planning attack formations, working out every possible scenario for how this confrontation could go. But underneath all the strategy and preparation was a simpler truth she couldn't quite escape. She was hunting her husband, the man she'd married, the man she'd loved or thought she loved, back when love seemed like something that mattered more than survival. Now she was tracking him through frozen forests with an army at her back, preparing to drag him out of whatever hole he'd crawled into and finish what she'd started in that throne room. The weight of it sat heavy in her chest. Not guilt exactly, She'd burned through guilt somewhere around the second night of discovering just how thoroughly he'd betrayed her. But something close to it. The recognition that once you crossed certain lines, you became someone else entirely. Someone harder. Someone capable of things you'd never imagined yourself doing. Selene wondered if Darius had felt this way when he'd started down his own path. If there'd been a moment when he'd looked at himself and realized he'd become a stranger. Or if he'd always been this person and she'd just been too blind to see it. The scouts returned an hour later with confirmation. Darius was there. Holed up in the old Merrick estate with at least 60 fighters, maybe more hidden in the surrounding buildings. Fortified position, defensible, supplied for a long siege if necessary. He'd been planning this. Even while sitting in that palace under guard, he'd been 3 steps ahead, arranging his escape, coordinating with loyalists, building the foundation for exactly this scenario. Selene had to admire the preparation, even as she hated what it meant. Her husband had always been brilliant at strategy. She'd loved that about him once. Now it was just another weapon pointed at her throat. "We can't storm it." Kaelin had ridden up during the scout report, studying the rough map they'd drawn in the dirt. Too many casualties. He'll hole up and wait for reinforcements from the northern houses. Turn this into a siege we can't win. So we don't storm it. Selene stared at the map, her mind racing through possibilities. We draw him out. Make him think he has an advantage. Get him into the open where numbers matter more than fortifications. And how do you draw out a man who knows you're hunting him? Kaelin's voice was skeptical. He's not stupid enough to walk into a trap. No. But he's arrogant enough to think he can turn one around. Selene looked up at Rhys. How many men can we spare for a feint? Rhys calculated silently for a moment. 30? Maybe 40, if you want it to look convincing. Send 40. Have them approach from the south, visible and loud. Make it look like a small force trying to scout his position. Selene turned back to the map. While he's focused on them, we circle around through the eastern woods with the main force. Hit him from the side while he's distracted. That only works if he takes the bait. Kaelin was frowning. If he smells the trap, he stays inside and we're back to siege warfare. Then we make the bait irresistible. Selene met his eyes. I lead the feint myself. Absolutely not. Rhys's voice was flat. You're the Empress. You don't put yourself in the line of heat. I'm the reason he'll come out. Selene cut him off. Darius doesn't want my army. He wants me. Wants to prove I'm weak, that I made a mistake challenging him. If he sees me with a small force, exposed and vulnerable, he won't be able to resist. His pride won't let him. She watched them both process it, saw the moment they realized she was right, and hated it. It's too dangerous, Rhys said finally. If something goes wrong, if he catches you before we can flank, then I die, and you finish this without me. Selene kept her voice steady. But it won't come to that. Darius wants me alive. Wants to parade me in front of the noble houses as proof of his power. He'll try to capture, not kill. That buys us time. Kaelin was studying her with those careful exile eyes. You're betting your life that your husband still cares enough not to murder you outright. I'm betting my life that his ego is bigger than his hatred. Selene smiled coldly. And I've never lost that bet yet. They argued for another 20 minutes, but Selene held firm. It was the right strategy. The only strategy that didn't end with them bleeding out against fortified walls while Darius called for reinforcements and turned this into the civil war she'd been desperately trying to avoid. Finally, Rhys gave in with the tight-jawed reluctance of a soldier following orders he knew were tactically sound but personally despised. 2 hours later, Selene rode out at the head of 40 soldiers, approaching the Merrick estate from the south with enough noise and visibility to announce their presence to anyone paying attention. Behind them, hidden in the eastern woods, Rhys was moving the main force into position. The estate appeared through the trees gradually, a sprawling manor house surrounded by outbuildings and a low stone wall that had probably been impressive 50 years ago. Now it was just crumbling fortification held together by desperation and the kind of arrogance that thought old glory still counted for something. Smoke rose from multiple chimneys. Guards moved along the walls. Selene counted at least 20 visible fighters, which meant probably twice that many hidden. She reined her horse to a stop just outside bow range and waited. For a long moment, nothing happened. Just the wind through the pine trees and the creak of leather and the sound of 40 soldiers trying not to look as nervous as they felt. Then the gate opened. Darius walked out alone. He looked different than he had in the palace. Rougher. He'd abandoned the formal clothing, the careful grooming, all the performance of civilization. Now he wore fighting leathers and his hair was loose, and there was something wild in his eyes that Celine had seen before, but never quite this intense. He looked like a man who'd stopped pretending to be anything other than what he was. A predator. He stopped 30 feet from her horse, close enough to talk, far enough to retreat if things went wrong. His voice carried across the cold air. "You came yourself." "I'm flattered." Celine kept her hands loose on the reins, her posture relaxed despite every instinct screaming at her to be ready for violence. "Thought we should talk. One last time, before this gets uglier than it already is." Darius laughed, short and bitter. "Talk? Like we're still married, like you didn't destroy everything we built together." "You destroyed it. I just refused to die quietly while you did." He studied her for a long moment, and something shifted in his expression. Something that looked almost like genuine confusion. "I never wanted you dead, Celine. I wanted you safe, comfortable. Out of the way, yes, but alive." "Out of the way of what?" Celine kept her voice steady. "Your coup? Your power grab? The conspiracy you built with foreign houses to carve up the empire?" "I was saving the empire." Darius's voice hardened. "From you. From your obsession with reform and justice and all the idealistic garbage that sounds good in council chambers, but gets people killed in the real world. The noble houses were ready to revolt. The military was fracturing. I was holding everything together the only way that actually works. By stealing from the treasury, by promising away territories you had no right to give, by making the deals that needed making." Darius took a step closer. "You think power is about laws and proper procedure. It's not. It's about knowing when to break the rules before the rules break you. I was protecting us, protecting the crown. You were too naive to see it. And Lara Voss? Was she part of protecting the crown too?" For the first time, something like shame flickered across his face. Then it was gone, buried under the same hard certainty. Lyra understood what it takes to rule. She didn't question every decision, didn't challenge every move. She trusted me to lead. She was a spy from a rival house using you to destabilize the kingdom. Darius went very still. "What?" "The conspiracy wasn't just yours, Darius. It was theirs." Celine felt a cold satisfaction watching the information land. "House Voss has been trying to undermine the crown for 3 generations. Lyra was their weapon. She got close to you, convinced you I was the problem, helped you build a coup that would have destroyed both of us and left the empire weak enough for them to carve up." "You're lying. I have the letters, the financial records, everything." Celine kept her voice flat. "You thought you were playing her. She was playing you the entire time. She watched him process it, saw the moment the pieces clicked together in his mind, and he realized how thoroughly he'd been manipulated. The rage that flooded his expression was almost frightening in its intensity. "Where is she?" "Gone. Fled the capital the moment your plan fell apart. Probably halfway to the Western Territories by now, with enough intelligence about our defenses to sell to the highest bidder." Darius's hands curled into fists at his sides. His wolf was rising, gold bleeding into his eyes, the air pressure around them changing as his power leaked out unchecked. This was the dangerous moment, the point where rage could tip over into violence that would get everyone killed. Celine kept her voice calm, reasonable. "It's over, Darius. The conspiracy failed. The houses that pledged to you are already abandoning ship now that they know House Voss was using you. Come back to the capital. Face trial. Take whatever dignity you have left." "Dignity." Darius's voice was thick with contempt. "You took my crown, my power, everything that made me who I am. And you want to talk about dignity? I want to talk about ending this before it becomes a war that kills thousands of innocent people." Celine leaned forward in her saddle. "You lost. Accept it. Move on." For a moment she thought he might actually listen, thought she saw something break behind his eyes, some final acceptance that this was finished. Then he smiled, and Celine realized with cold horror that she'd made a terrible mistake. "I didn't lose." Darius's voice was soft, almost gentle. "You did. You just don't know it yet." He raised his hand and snapped his fingers. Behind Celine, one of her soldiers drove a dagger into the back of the man next to him. Then another. Then 5 more. Chaos erupted as her own forces turned on each other, soldiers she'd trusted suddenly revealing themselves as Darius's plants, weapons appearing from nowhere, blood spraying across frozen ground. Celine's horse reared as fighting exploded around her. She fought to control it, reaching for her sword, her wolf surging forward, ready to shift and tear through anything that came close. But she was surrounded, betrayed by her own people. The 40 soldiers she'd brought were dying around her, killed by the traitors Darius had somehow planted in her ranks. She hadn't been leading a feint. She'd been leading a sacrifice. Darius walked toward her through the carnage, calm and unhurried. "You thought I didn't know you were coming. Thought I'd be arrogant enough to walk into your trap." His smile was cold. "I've been planning this for 6 months, Celine. I knew every move you'd make before you made it." "How?" The word came out raw. "Because I know you. Know how you think. Know that you'd try to be clever instead of overwhelming. Know that you'd risk yourself to end this quickly." Darius stopped beside her horse. "And I know you trusted Kaelin." Celine's blood turned to ice. "No!" "Oh yes." Darius's voice was almost pitying. "My dear brother, the wronged exile, the perfect ally who understood your pain. Did you really think I'd exile him without keeping him on a leash? He's been mine the entire time. Every piece of information you shared with him, he shared with me. Every plan you made, I knew about before the ink dried." Celine looked back toward the eastern woods where Rhys was supposed to be flanking with the main force, where 200 soldiers were supposed to be waiting to spring the trap. The woods were silent. No army, no rescue, no carefully planned ambush, just emptiness and the growing realization that she'd been outmaneuvered so completely it was almost beautiful in its cruelty. Kaelin appeared from the manor, walking casually through the fighting. He looked at Celine without apology. "Sorry. Nothing personal. But he's my brother. Blood wins. Always does. You were investigating him, trying to warn the council." Celine's voice was hollow. "The letters. The evidence. Yeah, that was good, wasn't it?" Kaelin smiled. "Darius's idea. Make it look like I was the righteous one. Build a false history that would make you trust me when the time came. And it worked perfectly." "Where's Rhys?" "Dead, probably." Kaelin shrugged. "We ambushed the main force about an hour ago, caught them in the eastern pass. They never saw it coming. By now your entire army is either corpses or prisoners." The world tilted sideways. Celine felt her wolf howling inside her skull, felt her grip on control starting to fracture. 200 soldiers. Dead because she'd trusted the wrong person. Because she'd thought she was smart enough to outplay a man who'd spent years perfecting betrayal. Darius reached up and grabbed her horse's bridle, forcing the animal still. "You could have just stepped aside quietly. Could have accepted exile, lived out your life in comfort somewhere far from here. Instead, you had to fight. Had to prove you were strong enough to challenge me." His hand shot out faster than she could react and yanked her from the saddle. She hit the ground hard, the impact driving air from her lungs. Before she could recover, guards were on her, forcing her arms behind her back, binding her wrists with silver chains that burned against her skin and suppressed her wolf. Darius crouched beside her, his face inches from hers. "Now you get to watch what happens when you challenge someone who actually knows how to hold power. You get to watch me march on that capital you tried to steal. Watch me take back my throne. Watch me execute every house that sided with you." His voice dropped to a whisper. "And when it's over, when I'm standing in that throne room with your empire burning around me, then I'll decide whether you live or die." He stood, gesturing to the guards. "Take her inside. Chain her in the basement. I want her alive and aware for what comes next." They dragged Celine to her feet. She tried to struggle, but the silver was draining her strength, making her wolf retreat deeper and deeper until she could barely feel it anymore. Around her, the last of her soldiers were being slaughtered or captured. 40 people who'd trusted her to lead them, now dead because she'd been too arrogant to see the trap closing around her. As they hauled her toward the manor, she caught one last glimpse of Darius conferring with Kaelin, already planning their next move. 2 brothers reunited. The conspiracy she'd thought she'd uncovered had just been surface level, the tip of something much deeper and more carefully constructed. She'd never had a chance. The realization settled over her like ice water. From the moment Kaelin had shown up, From the moment she'd trusted him with her plans, she'd been walking exactly where Darius wanted her to walk. Straight into his hands. The basement was stone and darkness and the smell of earth that hadn't seen sunlight in decades. They chained her to the wall with silver shackles on her wrists and ankles, the metal burning constant and sharp, keeping her wolf buried so deep she could barely sense it. Then they left her alone. Celine slumped against the stone, her mind racing even as her body screamed with pain and exhaustion. She'd lost. Completely, utterly lost. Her army was destroyed. Her allies were dead or captured. Darius had outplayed her so thoroughly she almost admired the precision of it. Almost. Hours passed. Maybe days. Hard to tell in the darkness. No one came except once to throw stale bread and water through the door. She forced herself to eat despite her stomach rebelling, forced herself to drink, forced herself to stay functional, because the moment she gave up was the moment Darius really won. She had to think. Had to find some angle, some weakness, some way out of this nightmare she'd walked herself into. But every path forward was blocked, every option eliminated. She was chained in a basement with silver burning her wrists while her husband prepared to march on the capital and execute everyone who'd supported her. There was no clever strategy left, no brilliant move that would turn this around. Just the brutal reality that sometimes you lost. Sometimes you bet everything on the wrong person and it destroyed you. The door opened. Lyra Voss stepped through. Celine stared at her through the darkness, her exhausted mind trying to process this new impossibility. You're supposed to be fled, running to the Western Territories. Lyra laughed softly, closing the door behind her. That's what we wanted you to think. Wanted you distracted, looking for threats in the wrong direction, while the real trap closed around you. She moved closer, studying Celine with clinical interest. You're not as smart as everyone says. Just lucky. And luck runs out. You're House Voss. A spy. I had the evidence. You had what we wanted you to have. Lyra crouched down, bringing herself to eye level. House Voss isn't trying to destroy the Empire. We're trying to save it. From weak leaders who think justice matters more than strength. From empresses who don't understand what it actually takes to hold power. So you used Darius. We gave Darius the tools to save himself from you. Lyra's voice was matter of fact. He loved you once, really loved you, but you kept challenging him, kept questioning his decisions, kept trying to share power instead of understanding that power doesn't share. We just helped him see what needed to happen. And now he marches on the capital with 3,000 troops from the northern houses, takes back his throne, executes the traitors, restores order. Lyra stood. And House Voss gets rewarded for our loyalty with exactly the territories and influence we were promised. Everyone wins, except you. She moved toward the door, then paused. For what it's worth, I don't hate you. You're just a casualty of how the world actually works. Idealism is beautiful, but it loses to pragmatism every single time. The door closed. Darkness returned. Celine hung from her chains and felt something inside her finally break. Not her spirit. Not her will to survive. That was iron, forged through too many years of fighting to ever really shatter. But the last piece of who she'd been before this started. The woman who'd believed in laws and justice, and the idea that doing the right thing mattered. The Empress who'd thought she could change the Empire by being better than the corruption she fought. That woman died in a basement chained to a wall while her enemies planned her execution. What crawled up from underneath was something else. Something colder and harder, and willing to do whatever it took to survive. Not for justice, not for the Empire, just for the pure animal need to keep breathing, to not let these people win, to drag herself out of this hole even if it meant becoming exactly what she'd spent her entire life trying not to be. Celine tested the chains. Solid, well made, no weak points. She tested the wall. Ancient stone, but thick and stable. She tested her wolf. Buried deep under the silver's suppression, barely a whisper. Then she tested the one thing she hadn't let herself consider before, her own willingness to pay any price for survival, and found it infinite. Somewhere above her, Darius and Lyra and Kaelin were celebrating their victory, planning their march, confident that the threat was neutralized, that the Empress was broken, that power was theirs again. They'd forgotten the most important rule of dealing with wolves. The most dangerous ones are the ones you corner with nothing left to lose. Celine closed her eyes and started planning. Not escape, not yet. That would come later. Right now, she just needed to survive long enough to see one more sunrise. After that, she'd burn down everyone who'd put her in this darkness, starting with her husband, and ending only when the entire empire understood exactly what happened when you tried to break someone who'd learned how to weaponize their own destruction. The chains burned. The darkness pressed close. And deep in Celine Vale's chest, something ancient and vicious finally stopped pretending to be civilized and bared its teeth at the world. The darkness taught Celine things about herself she'd spent 32 years trying not to learn. That she could survive on rage alone when everything else was stripped away. That pain became background noise if you lived with it long enough. That the difference between an empress and an animal was thinner than anyone wanted to admit. And when you crossed that line deliberately instead of by accident, you became something neither civilization nor wilderness knew how to handle. Something worse than both. She counted time by the meals they brought. Stale bread and water twice a day meant 48 hours had passed since they'd chained her in this hole. 96 hours meant 4 days. At 120 hours, she stopped counting and started planning in earnest because numbers didn't matter anymore. Only survival did. The silver burned constant against her wrists and ankles, keeping her wolf suppressed so deep she could barely feel it breathing. But suppressed wasn't dead. Every hour she spent forcing herself to stay still, to conserve energy, to not waste strength fighting chains that wouldn't break, her wolf was slowly adapting to the poison. Learning to exist underneath it. Growing harder and meaner in the suffocating dark. Wolves were adaptable like that. Push them into corners and they either died or evolved into something you shouldn't have created. Celine was evolving. On what she estimated was the 6th day, the door opened and actual light spilled through. Not much, just enough to make her eyes water and her head pound. A guard stepped in, young and nervous, carrying more bread and a clay cup of water. He set them down just inside her reach, careful not to get too close, then turned to leave. Celine spoke for the first time in days, her voice raw from disuse. "What's your name?" The guard froze, looked back at her with wide, uncertain eyes. "Your name." She kept her tone gentle, despite everything screaming inside her. "I just want to know who's feeding me. Seems like basic courtesy." He hesitated. Then, "Marcus." "Thank you, Marcus." Celine shifted slightly, making the chains rattle. "How old are you?" 23, ma'am." He was still hovering near the door, torn between duty and the basic human impulse to respond when someone spoke to you like a person instead of a prisoner. "You have family? Wife? Children? Sister?" Marcus swallowed. "She's 12. I send her money every month for school." "That's good. Education matters." Celine leaned forward as much as the chains allowed. "Marcus, I need you to listen very carefully. When Darius marches on the capital, a lot of people are going to die, including you probably, because the forces defending that city won't surrender easily, and whoever survives the initial assault will be executed as traitors for following a dethroned king into rebellion. I'm just following orders, ma'am. Everyone's just following orders." Celine held his gaze, right up until the moment those orders get them killed. Then it doesn't matter anymore whose side they were on. They're just dead. Marcus shifted uncomfortably. "I should go." "Wait, just one more thing." Celine's voice dropped lower. "Your sister, the 12-year-old, when they march on the capital and the fighting starts, she's going to be right in the middle of it, because that's where the school is. East District, near the market. I know because I personally funded 3 educational facilities in that area specifically to give children from working families a chance." She watched her words land, watched the fear bloom in his eyes as he processed what she was really saying. "When the siege starts, Marcus, when houses start burning and people start dying, your sister will be there. And no amount of money you send will save her from what's coming." His hand was shaking slightly on the door handle. "You're trying to manipulate me. I'm trying to save your sister's life." Celine kept her voice steady. "Get her out of the capital, tonight if you can. Send her south to relatives, anywhere away from the city, because in 3 days, maybe 4, Darius is going to turn that place into a graveyard, and anyone left inside is going to burn with it." "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I'm done watching innocent people die for other people's power games." Celine leaned back against the stone. "And because if you're smart, you'll realize that the woman chained in a basement is offering to save your family while the king upstairs is preparing to use her as kindling for his ego. Marcus stood frozen for a long moment. Then he left, closing the door fast like he was afraid of what might happen if he stayed longer. Celine waited in the returning darkness and counted slowly to 500. Then she reached for the bread he'd left and found what she'd been searching for since they'd locked her down here. The clay cup had cracked slightly when he'd set it down. Not much. Just a hairline fracture running down one side. But clay shattered if you applied pressure right, and shattered clay made edges. Edges were weapons if you were desperate enough. She worked through the night, using the wall to grind the cup against stone, widening the crack, creating a sharp point. The sound was soft enough that the guards outside probably couldn't hear it. Probably. But she didn't have a choice. Either she tried this or she waited for Darius to decide her usefulness was finished. Celine had always been terrible at waiting. By what felt like dawn, she had a primitive blade. Sharp enough to cut skin if she was careful. Sharp enough to work through leather if she had time. The chains were silver, unbreakable, but the leather straps holding them to the wall brackets were just leather. Treated and reinforced, but still organic material that could be severed with enough patience and the right tool. She started working on her left wrist binding, sawing carefully through layers of leather with a piece of broken clay while her arm screamed from the angle and the silver burned deeper into her skin with every movement. Hours passed. The leather was thick. Progress came in fractions of millimeters. Celine's fingers went numb, then started bleeding where she'd gripped the makeshift blade wrong. She ignored the pain and kept sawing. The door opened again. Different guard this time, older and harder faced. He set down food without speaking, checked that the chains were still secure, then left. Celine waited until his footsteps faded, then went back to work. She'd learned something in that basement about the nature of survival. It wasn't about being strong or clever or having the best strategy. It was about being willing to keep moving forward when every rational part of your brain was screaming that there was no point, that you were just prolonging the inevitable, that you should accept defeat and save yourself the pain of fighting. Survival was the decision to ignore that voice and keep sawing through leather with a broken cup while your wrist bled and your wolf whimpered in suppressed agony somewhere deep inside your skull. It was the choice to believe you had a future worth fighting for, even when all evidence suggested otherwise. And Celine had always been exceptional at ignoring evidence that contradicted what she needed to be true. The leather on her left wrist gave way just as the door opened again. Celine froze, the clay blade hidden in her palm, her freed hand hanging loose but still positioned like it was bound. The guard who entered was Marcus. He looked even more nervous than before. He set down the food, started to turn away, then hesitated. "I sent my sister south this morning." His voice was barely audible. "Told her it was a holiday surprise. She's staying with our aunt. That's good." Celine kept very still. "That's smart." Marcus looked at her directly for the first time. "Are you really going to stop him? Stop the king?" "I don't know." Celine met his eyes. "But I'm going to try. And if I die trying, at least your sister won't be in the capital when it burns." He nodded slowly. Then he did something that changed everything. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small vial, set it on the ground just inside her reach. "Silver suppressant. It won't break the chains, but it'll let your wolf surface enough to heal faster. Give you strength." His hand was shaking. "That's all I can do. If anyone finds out I helped you, they'll kill me." "Why are you helping me?" "Because you're right." Marcus's voice cracked slightly. "When the siege starts, a lot of people are going to die. And I don't want to be one of the ones who made it happen just because I was too scared to do the right thing." He left quickly, not waiting for a response. Celine reached for the vial with her freed hand, uncorked it, and drank the bitter liquid in one swallow. The effect was immediate. The burning eased fractionally, and deep inside her chest, her wolf stirred. Not free, not strong, but present, awake, ready. Celine went back to work on the other wrist binding with renewed focus. The clay blade was wearing down, but she could feel the leather starting to give. Another few hours, maybe. She could manage that. What she couldn't manage was time. Somewhere above her, Darius was preparing to march. Every hour she spent in this basement was an hour closer to the capital burning and thousands of people dying in a civil war that would tear the empire apart. She had to move faster. The second wrist binding gave way just as voices erupted upstairs. Shouting, the sound of many feet moving at once, orders being barked in tones that suggested urgency. Something was happening. Celine worked frantically on the ankle bindings, sawing through leather with what was left of her blade. The left ankle came free, then the right. The chains were still locked around her limbs, heavy and burning, but no longer attached to the wall. She stood for the first time in 6 days, and her legs nearly gave out. The world tilted sideways, and her vision swam black. She grabbed the wall, forced herself upright, forced her body to remember how to balance. Above her, the shouting intensified. Then she heard something that made her blood run cold. Rhys's voice, alive, furious, and very close. The commander of the Royal Guard hadn't died in that ambush. Somehow, he'd survived, escaped, and now he was here tearing through the manor, hunting for her. The basement door exploded inward. Not Rhys. 3 of Darius's guards, weapons drawn, rushing down the steps to secure the prisoner before whatever chaos was happening upstairs reached her. They saw her standing unchained and their eyes went wide. Celine moved. 6 days of captivity had weakened her body, but sharpened her mind into something cold and precise. She knew she couldn't win a straight fight. The silver was still suppressing her wolf, still draining her strength. But she didn't need to win. She just needed them close enough to make mistakes. The first guard reached for her, and Celine drove the broken clay blade into his throat. Not deep, just enough to make him choke and stumble backward into the second guard. They tangled together, and Celine grabbed the fallen man's sword, swung it in a wild arc that caught the second guard across the face. The third guard had his sword up and was moving in carefully, not making the same mistake as his companions. He was trained, focused, not underestimating her anymore. Celine threw the sword at his head. He blocked it automatically, and in that half-second distraction she was on him, using the chain still attached to her wrist as a weapon, wrapping it around his throat and pulling with everything she had left. They went down together in a tangle of limbs and desperation. He was stronger, but she was fighting like something that had already accepted death and just wanted to take him with her. That made her more dangerous than any amount of training. The chain tightened. He struggled. Celine held on and felt something ancient and vicious inside her chest purr with satisfaction as his movement slowed, stopped, went limp. She stood shakily, covered in other people's blood, chains hanging from her wrists and ankles like she was some kind of escaped nightmare. Above her, the fighting had reached a crescendo. Steel on steel, men screaming, the particular sound violence made when it stopped being contained and turned into chaos. Celine grabbed a sword from one of the fallen guards and moved up the stairs. The main floor of the manor was carnage. Rhys had brought what looked like 50 soldiers, remnants of the force Darius had supposedly destroyed, and they were fighting through the building room by room. Darius's guards were falling back, outnumbered and surprised, trying to form defensive positions. Celine emerged from the basement into the middle of a hallway filled with fighting men, and for a moment nobody noticed her. Just another figure with a sword in the chaos. Then Rhys turned, saw her, and his expression went from grim determination to something like relief so profound it was almost painful to witness. "My lady." He cut down a guard who'd been moving toward her. "You're alive." "Barely." Celine's voice came out rougher than she'd intended. "Where's Darius?" "Upstairs." War room. Rhys fought his way closer to her, other soldiers forming up around them. "Kaelin's with him, and maybe 20 fighters. We need to move fast before they realize we're here for you and kill you outright." "How did you survive the ambush?" "Barely." Rhys's face was grim. "Lost half the force. The rest of us scattered, regrouped in the southern forest. Took us 3 days to figure out where they'd taken you." His jaw tightened. "I should have seen the trap. Should have known Kaelin was compromised. We all should have." Celine tested her grip on the sword. The silver chains made her movements clumsy, but she could work with it. "Right now, we end this, one way or another." They fought their way through the manor with brutal efficiency. Celine moved like something possessed, using the chains as much as the blade, fighting with a desperate ferocity born from 6 days of helplessness and rage that had nowhere else to go. Every guard who fell brought her closer to the man who'd put her in that darkness. The stairs to the second floor were defended by 10 of Darius's best fighters. They held for maybe 5 minutes before Reese's forces overwhelmed them through sheer determination and the particular advantage of fighting for someone they genuinely wanted to save. The war room door was reinforced oak. Reese kicked it once, twice, and on the third impact it splintered inward. Darius was standing at a table covered in maps and troop positions. Kaelin stood beside him. 20 guards ringed the room, weapons already drawn. For a moment, nobody moved. They just stared at each other across 10 feet of empty space and the weight of everything that had led them to this moment. Then Darius smiled. "Should have killed you when I had the chance." His voice was conversational, like they were discussing weather instead of civil war. "But I wanted you to see me win first. Wanted you to watch everything you fought for collapse. Guess I was too sentimental. Sentimentality wasn't your problem." Celine's voice was steady despite her heart trying to hammer through her ribs. "Your problem was thinking I'd stay broken. You look pretty broken to me." Darius gestured at the chain still hanging from her limbs, the blood covering her clothing, the way she was barely standing upright. "How long do you really think you can last in a fight? You're running on fumes and rage. That's more than enough." Celine raised her sword. "This ends now, Darius. You, me. Whoever wins takes the Empire. Whoever loses dies. Clean, simple. The way it should have been from the start." Darius studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "All right, clear the room." Kaelin started to protest. "Brother, you don't have to—" "Clear the room." Darius's voice carried absolute authority. "This is between me and her, always has been. Let us finish it." The guards hesitated, looking to Kaelin for confirmation. He nodded reluctantly, and they filed out, Reese's soldiers backing away as well, until it was just Celine and Darius facing each other with weapons drawn, and no one left to stop what came next. Reese paused at the door. "My lady, if you need—" "I won't." Celine didn't take her eyes off Darius. "Close the door, Commander. This is private." The door closed. They were alone. Darius rolled his shoulders, loosening up, his wolf starting to surface as gold bled into his eyes. "You really think you can beat me? Even without the silver, even at full strength, you were never quite as good as me in a straight fight." "No." Celine let her own wolf rise as much as the suppressant allowed. "But I don't need to be better. I just need to be more desperate. And you made me desperate when you put me in that basement and left me to count the hours until you decided to kill me. I wasn't going to kill you." Darius's voice held something that might have been regret. "Exile. Far south, where you couldn't interfere. That was always the plan. Then you should have done it instead of letting your ego get in the way." Celine shifted her grip on the sword. "Because now I'm going to kill you instead. Not for the Empire. Not for justice. Just because you made me something that can't stop until you're dead." And there it was. The truth they'd been dancing around since that throne room confrontation. This wasn't about crowns or kingdoms or who deserved power. This was about two predators who'd been forced into the same territory, and only one could walk away. Sometimes the simplest explanation was the truest one. Darius moved first. He was faster than she expected, closing the distance before she could properly react, his blade coming down in an overhead strike that would have split her skull if she hadn't rolled sideways at the last second. Steel hit the wooden floor where she'd been standing and bit deep. Celine came up swinging, her blade catching his shoulder, cutting through leather but not deep enough to do real damage. He spun away and they circled each other, both bleeding now, both breathing hard. The fight was brutal and graceless. No fancy technique, no strategic brilliance, just two people with swords trying to kill each other in a room that smelled like old wood and spilled blood. Celine was slower, weaker, the silver and captivity having stolen too much of her strength. But she was also beyond caring about her own survival in a way that made her dangerous. She took risks Darius wouldn't, threw herself into strikes that could have gotten her killed if they missed. Used the chains as weapons, whipping them at his face to create openings, accepting cuts and bruises because pain didn't matter anymore. Nothing mattered except making sure he didn't walk out of this room. Darius fought more carefully, more defensively, because he still had things to lose. Still had his grand vision of reclaiming the throne, of proving he was right and she was wrong. That caution cost him. Celine's blade caught him across the ribs, opening a deep gash that made him stagger. He recovered quickly, but she was already inside his guard, too close for swords, and they crashed together in a tangle of limbs and desperation. They hit the floor hard, the swords scattered away. Suddenly it wasn't a duel anymore. It was just violence, raw and primal. They fought like animals, claws out, teeth bared, Celine's partially suppressed wolf screaming for blood, while Darius's fully manifested power tried to overwhelm her through sheer force. His hands closed around her throat. Squeezed. Celine's vision started to narrow, black creeping in from the edges. She could feel her windpipe closing, her lungs screaming for air they couldn't get. This was it. This was how she died. Strangled by the man she'd married. Poetic in a sick kind of way. Then her fingers found the chain still hanging from her wrist, and muscle memory from 6 days of captivity took over. She whipped it up and around, wrapping it across his throat the same way she'd killed that guard in the basement, pulling with everything she had left. Darius's grip loosened as he tried to tear the chain away. They rolled across the floor, both choking, both refusing to let go, locked in a death grip that would end with one of them unconscious or dead. Celine's strength was failing. Her muscles were giving out. The silver and exhaustion and blood loss were finally catching up to her. She couldn't hold on much longer. She didn't need much longer. Darius's movement slowed. His hands fell away from her throat. His eyes, still gold with wolf fury, locked on hers with an expression she couldn't quite read. Recognition, maybe? Or just the acceptance that sometimes you lost the fight you should have won. His body went limp under her. Celine held the chain tight for 10 more seconds, making absolutely certain he wasn't faking. Then she released it and rolled away, gasping for air, her throat on fire, her vision swimming. She lay on the floor next to her husband's unconscious body and tried to remember how to breathe. The door burst open. Rhys rushed in with sword drawn, taking in the scene with tactical efficiency. "My lady, are you—" "He's alive." Celine's voice came out as a rasp. "Chain him. Silver. Maximum restraints. If he wakes up unsecured, we're all dead." Rhys gestured and soldiers poured in, securing Darius with the kind of thoroughness that suggested they'd learned from his earlier escape. Celine watched them work and felt nothing. No triumph, no relief. Just exhaustion and the hollow certainty that this still wasn't over. Kaelin appeared in the doorway, flanked by guards. He looked at his unconscious brother, then at Celine, and his expression was unreadable. "So you actually won." He sounded almost impressed. "Against every advantage, you actually pulled it off." "Where's Lyra?" Celine forced herself to sit up despite every muscle screaming in protest. "Gone." Fled when she heard Rhys was attacking the manor, probably halfway to the Western Territories by now. Kaelin's smile was thin. House Voss always did know when to run. "You helped him destroy my army. Killed 200 of my people." Celine met his eyes. "Give me one reason I shouldn't execute you right here. Because I'm the only legitimate heir if Darius is removed." Kaelin's voice was calm, practical. "You need me to prevent a succession crisis. The northern houses will never accept you ruling alone, but they'll accept me with you as regent. It's the only path forward that doesn't end in total civil war." He was right. Celine hated that he was right, but pragmatism had kept her alive this long. No point abandoning it now. "You betray me again. I won't chain you in a basement. I'll just kill you. Understood? Perfectly." Kaelin inclined his head. "For what it's worth, I didn't enjoy it. It was just necessary. Everything's necessary until suddenly it isn't." Celine let Rhys help her to her feet. "Take Darius to the capital. Maximum security. Triple the guard rotations. I want him in chains so heavy he can't move without help." "What about you?" Rhys was studying her with concern. "You need medical attention. Need rest. I need to address the capital before rumors spin completely out of control." Celine tested her weight on her legs and found them mostly functional. "How fast can we march?" 6 hours if we push hard." "Then we push hard." Celine looked around the war room at the maps and plans Darius had been making. Plans to siege the capital, to execute her supporters, to burn down everything she'd tried to build. "We end this today. One way or another, the Empire gets clarity about who leads it." She walked out of that room with Rhys beside her and 50 soldiers forming up around her like a protective wall. Behind them, unconscious and chained, Darius was being carried out on a stretcher. The woman who'd entered that manor in chains 6 days ago was gone. The woman who walked out was something the Empire had never quite seen before. Someone who'd been broken deliberately, and had welded herself back together with pure spite and the refusal to let anyone decide her fate except her. The 6-hour march felt like 6 minutes and 6 years simultaneously. Celine forced herself to stay upright, to keep moving, to project strength even though every step sent pain radiating through her battered body. Soldiers kept glancing at her with expressions caught between awe and concern, like they couldn't quite believe what they were seeing but were afraid to look away. Let them look. Let them see what someone became when you tried to bury them, and they clawed their way back to the surface anyway. The capital appeared on the horizon just as the sun began setting, the palace rising above the city like a promise or a threat, depending on where you stood. Celine stared at it and felt something crystallize in her chest. That throne was hers. Not because she'd been born to it, not because she'd married into it, but because she'd fought for it through every betrayal and every trap, and every moment when giving up would have been so much easier than continuing. She'd earned it in blood and survival and the kind of determination that didn't know how to quit, even when quitting was the smart choice. The gates opened as they approached. Word of their arrival had spread, and crowds lined the streets, citizens and nobles and merchants all pressing close to see the Empress who'd disappeared and the king being brought back in chains. The silence was deafening. Celine rode through it with her head high and her chains still hanging from her wrists because there hadn't been time to remove them properly, and somehow it felt right to let everyone see exactly what she'd survived. The palace courtyard filled with witnesses as they dismounted. The royal council was there, looking nervous. Noble houses who'd pledged to both sides, hedging their bets. Servants and guards, and everyone whose life depended on understanding who held power now. Celine stood before them all, bloodied and chained and victorious, and let the moment stretch until the tension was almost unbearable. Then she spoke, her voice carrying across the courtyard with the particular authority of someone who'd stopped asking permission to lead. Darius Thorne betrayed the crown, the empire, and every person who trusted him. He's been captured and will stand trial for treason. Until that trial concludes, I am assuming full authority as Empress Regent with Kaelin Thorne serving as my heir and advisor. Anyone who has a problem with that can say so now. Silence. Absolute. Complete. Then someone in the crowd began clapping. Slowly at first, hesitant, then others joined until the entire courtyard erupted in applause that might have been approval or relief, or just the communal release of tension that came from surviving a crisis that could have destroyed them all. Celine accepted it with a nod. Then she turned and walked into her palace, trailing blood and broken chains, and finally allowed herself to believe she might actually survive this. Behind her, Darius was being carried down to the same cells he'd once used to imprison his enemies. The symmetry was almost perfect. Almost. The trial lasted 3 days and felt like 3 lifetimes compressed into a moment that the entire empire held its breath to witness. They held it in the grand throne room because nowhere else was large enough to contain the flood of nobles and citizens who demanded to see justice served or vengeance claimed, depending on which side of history they'd chosen to stand on. Celine sat on her throne wearing formal regalia that felt heavier than the chains she'd worn in that basement. Crown of silver and moonstone, gown of deep midnight blue embroidered with wolves that seemed to move in the flickering torchlight. She looked every inch the Empress she'd fought to become. But inside, beneath all the performance and power, she was just tired. The kind of exhaustion that sleep couldn't fix because it lived in your bones and your soul, and the space between heartbeats where you counted all the things you'd lost to get here. Darius stood in the center of the hall in chains that were probably excessive, but nobody wanted to take chances. Not after he'd escaped once. Not after everything he'd done. He wore prisoner's gray, and his hair hung loose around his face, and he looked smaller somehow than he had when he'd ruled. Power did that. Gave you size and weight that disappeared the moment it was stripped away, leaving just the man underneath. And the man underneath was broken in ways Celine hadn't expected to feel sorry about, but somehow did anyway. The charges were read by Lord Chancellor Henrik, in a voice that shook slightly despite his attempts to sound authoritative. Conspiracy against the crown, theft of royal funds, treason, attempted murder. The list went on, and each crime was documented with evidence Celine had spent weeks compiling. Letters, financial records, witness testimony from servants and guards and nobles who'd finally found the courage to speak once they knew which way the wind was blowing. It was thorough. It was damning. It was everything needed to justify execution by every law the Empire had ever written. Darius listened to all of it, with his head down and his eyes fixed on the marble floor like he was looking for escape routes in the patterns. When Henrik finally finished and asked how he pleaded, Darius raised his head and looked directly at Celine. Guilty. His voice was steady. To everything except attempting to murder my wife. That was never the plan. Exile, yes. Removal from power, yes. But not death. I want that on record. Noted. Celine kept her voice neutral despite the way her chest tightened hearing him claim that particular line like it mattered. Like there was a meaningful difference between locking someone in a basement and planning to kill them. What do you have to say in your defense? Darius was quiet for a long moment. Then, I did what I thought was necessary to save the Empire from fracturing. You were pushing reforms too fast, alienating the noble houses, creating instability. I tried to contain it quietly, and when that failed, I tried to remove you before the damage became irreversible. His jaw tightened. I was wrong about the methods, wrong about Lyra and House Voss using me, wrong about a lot of things. But I wasn't wrong about the threat. The Empire was fracturing. It still is, because you made it fracture. Celine leaned forward slightly. You created the instability you claimed to be preventing, turned houses against each other, stole resources that should have gone to infrastructure, undermined every attempt at genuine reform because it threatened your personal power. You weren't saving anything, Darius. You were just too arrogant to admit you were losing control. And what are you doing now? Darius's voice carried an edge of the old authority. Sitting on that throne executing your husband while the northern territories prepare to rebel and the southern houses wait to see if you're strong enough to hold power? You think this trial solves anything? It's just theater, performance to legitimize what you already decided. He wasn't wrong. The trial was performance. Everyone knew the verdict before the first witness testified. But performance mattered in politics because perception shaped reality, and right now the Empire needed to see that justice existed even at the highest levels. Needed to believe that power could be checked, that betrayal had consequences, that the crown stood for something more than whoever was ruthless enough to seize it. That didn't make it feel any less hollow. The council deliberated for exactly 4 hours before returning with their verdict. Guilty on all charges. The sentence was death by beheading, to be carried out at dawn in 3 days' time. The throne room erupted in noise, some cheering, some protesting, everyone with an opinion they desperately needed the world to hear. Celine let them vent for exactly 90 seconds, then raised her hand for silence and got it instantly. The sentence will be delayed pending further review. Her voice cut through the confusion. I'm invoking my right as Empress Regent to grant clemency consideration. Darius Thorne will remain imprisoned under maximum security while I determine if execution serves the Empire's interests or just my personal need for vengeance. The room exploded again, louder this time. Half the nobles looked furious that she was even considering clemency. The other half looked terrified she might actually execute him. Couldn't please everyone. That was the first lesson of ruling. The second was that trying to please anyone usually ended badly. Celine stood and walked out of the throne room while people shouted questions and objections and demands at her back. She ignored all of it and kept walking until she reached her private study and locked the door behind her. Then she collapsed into a chair and let herself feel everything she'd been suppressing throughout that trial. The grief, the rage, the bitter satisfaction of watching him fall, the hollow ache of realizing that winning didn't fix what was broken, that removing one corrupt king didn't automatically heal an empire that had been fracturing for decades, that she'd sacrificed so much to reach this moment, and it still felt like losing because the man she'd loved was going to die and part of her still cared despite everything. Power was supposed to make you untouchable. That's what everyone said. Get enough of it and nothing could hurt you anymore. But that was a lie. Power just meant you hurt differently. Hurt alone in locked rooms where nobody could see you bleed. Celine sat in her study and let herself bleed for exactly 10 minutes. Then she washed her face, fixed her crown, and got back to work because empires didn't run themselves. And grief was a luxury she'd have to schedule for later. The next 2 days were chaos dressed up as diplomacy. Nobles lining up to pledge loyalty or make demands or subtly threaten rebellion, depending on what she decided about Darius. The northern houses sent envoys warning that execution would be seen as tyranny and would force them to reconsider their allegiance. The southern houses sent different envoys suggesting that anything less than execution would be seen as weakness and would embolden future traitors. Everyone had opinions. Everyone was certain they knew what justice required. Nobody wanted to admit they were just positioning themselves for maximum advantage, regardless of what actually served the Empire's interests. Celine listened to all of them with the patient expression of someone who'd learned to hide exhaustion behind diplomatic smiles. Then she made her decisions quietly and alone, because that's what rulers did. Shouldered the weight and lived with the consequences, and never let anyone see how heavy it all felt. On the third morning, just before dawn, she went down to the cells where Darius was being held. The guards started to accompany her, but she waved them back. This conversation needed to be private. Some things couldn't be said with witnesses. Darius was awake when she arrived, sitting on the stone bench that passed for furniture in maximum security confinement. He looked up as she approached, and something almost like relief flickered across his face. Like he'd been waiting for this. Like he knew she'd come. Come to watch me die? His voice was rough from disuse. Or gloat? Either's fair. Neither. Celine stopped outside the cell bars, studying him in the dim torchlight. Came to ask you something I should have asked a long time ago. What's that? When did you stop loving me? The question hung between them like smoke. Darius looked at her for a long time before answering. I never stopped. His voice was so quiet she almost didn't hear it. That was the problem. If I'd stopped loving you, removing you would have been easy. Just another political move. But I loved you the entire time I was betraying you, and that made it worse. Made me hate myself, made me hate you for making me choose between you and the Empire. You didn't have to choose. We could have worked together. Could have built something better if you'd trusted me instead of trying to control everything. Maybe. Darius rubbed his face with manacled hands. Or maybe we were always doomed. Two alphas trying to share power in a system designed for one ruler. Something was always going to break. It just happened to be us. Celine felt something crack inside her chest, hearing him reduce their entire relationship to inevitable failure. Like there was never a chance. Like all those years of marriage and partnership and trying to build something together had been pointless from the start. But maybe he was right. Maybe some combinations of people were just destabilizing regardless of how much they cared about each other. Maybe love wasn't enough when power was involved because power changed people in ways love couldn't heal. I'm commuting your sentence. The words came out before she'd fully decided to say them. Exile instead of execution. You'll be stripped of all titles and holdings and sent beyond the northern border with enough resources to survive but not enough to raise an army. You'll never set foot in this empire again. If you do, the death sentence reinstates immediately. Darius stared at her like she'd just spoken a language he didn't understand. Why? After everything I did, why let me live? Because executing you turns you into a martyr. Celine kept her voice steady. The northern houses already want an excuse to rebel. Giving them a murdered king to rally around would be strategic suicide. This way, you're just a cautionary tale. The ruler who fell from power and disappeared into exile. People forget cautionary tales. They remember martyrs forever. It was a good explanation. Logical, tactically sound, also completely hollow. The truth was simpler and harder to admit. She was letting him live because some part of her still remembered what it felt like to love him before everything went wrong. Still remembered the man he'd been before power and paranoia had twisted him into someone capable of the things he'd done. She was letting him live because executing him would mean admitting that person had never existed. That she'd wasted years of her life loving someone who'd always been the monster instead of someone who'd become one. And she wasn't ready to accept that yet. Maybe never would be. Darius seemed to understand what she wasn't saying. He nodded slowly. When do I leave? Today. Before the sun fully rises, before anyone can protest or demand I reconsider. Celine stepped closer to the bars. You'll have an escort to the border. After that, you're on your own. Build a new life. Find whatever peace you can. Just stay away from here. And if I come back, then I'll kill you myself. Celine met his eyes and let him see she meant it. No trial, no mercy, just an ending. Fair enough? Darius stood, moving to the bars so they were face to face with only iron between them. For what it's worth, Celine, you'll be a better ruler than I ever was. You actually care about the people instead of just the power. That matters. It's going to have to. Celine wanted to reach through the bars, wanted some final gesture that would provide closure or forgiveness, or at least acknowledgement of what they'd been to each other. But she kept her hands at her sides because some distances couldn't be bridged. Some endings were just endings. She turned to leave, then paused. Darius, one more thing. Yeah? The woman you become after all this. She'll be harder than the one you married, colder, less willing to trust or compromise or believe in the best of people. Celine looked back at him. I want you to know that's your legacy. Not the conspiracy or the betrayal, just the fact that you took someone who believed in partnership and love and turned her into someone who rules alone because it's safer that way. Darius's expression crumbled. I'm sorry for all of it, for not being strong enough to choose us over ambition. Sorry doesn't fix anything, but maybe it's a start. Celine walked away before the grief in his voice could make her reconsider, before the weight of their shared history could drag her back into conversations that would just hurt without healing. She climbed the stairs back to the palace proper and didn't look back. By the time the sun rose fully over the capital, Darius was already beyond the northern border with 20 guards escorting him to wherever he'd chosen to disappear to. Celine watched from her window as the first light hit the city and told herself she'd made the right choice, the strategic choice, the choice that would prevent rebellion and keep the empire stable. She almost believed it. The weeks that followed were brutal in ways combat never was. Actual fighting had clear rules: kill or be killed, win or lose. Politics was messier. Every decision created consequences that rippled outward in ways you couldn't predict. Every compromise angered someone. Every firm stance alienated potential allies. Celine worked 18-hour days rebuilding what the conspiracy had broken, negotiating with the northern houses who were furious about Darius's exile but grudgingly accepted it was better than execution, shoring up support in the southern territories by following through on infrastructure reforms she'd been pushing for years, reorganizing the military command structure to remove everyone who'd been compromised by the coup. It was exhausting. It was necessary. It was the price of holding power you'd fought tooth and nail to claim. Kaelin helped more than she'd expected. He'd betrayed her once and probably would again if it served his interests, but for now their goals aligned and he was competent in ways she couldn't afford to ignore. He handled the noble houses she didn't have patience for, smoothed over diplomatic incidents, made himself useful enough that executing him would have been wasteful despite how satisfying it might have felt. That was the thing about ruling. You had to work with people who tried to destroy you because sometimes they were the best tools available. Had to swallow your pride and your hurt and your very reasonable desire for vengeance because pragmatism won wars when righteousness just got people killed. Celine learned to be pragmatic the way she'd learned everything else, through trial and error and the particular education that came from making mistakes and living with the consequences. 3 months after the trial, Rhys found her in the war room staring at maps of the Eastern Territories where border skirmishes were threatening to escalate into actual conflict. My lady, you should rest. You've been here for 14 hours. I'll rest when the Eastern situation is resolved. Celine didn't look up from the maps. If we don't respond decisively, it'll be seen as weakness. But if we respond too aggressively, we risk turning a border dispute into a full war we can't afford. Then find the middle path. Rhys moved closer, studying the same maps. That's what you're good at, finding solutions nobody else sees because they're too busy being certain about what's right. What if there isn't a middle path? What if sometimes you just have to choose between bad options and live with the damage? Then you choose the option that does the least damage. Rhys's voice was steady. But you don't destroy yourself in the process. That's not strength. That's just slow suicide dressed up as duty. Celine finally looked up at him. When did you become a philosopher? Around the same time I watched you almost die in a basement because you'd rather sacrifice yourself than ask for help. Rhys held her gaze. You won, my lady. You survived. You removed a corrupt king and claimed the throne and held the empire together through sheer force of will. But you're no good to anyone if you work yourself to death trying to fix everything alone. I'm not alone. I have you. Have Kaelin. Have a whole council of advisors who you don't trust because Kaelin betrayed you, and trust is hard to rebuild once it's been shattered. Rhys's expression softened. I understand that. I do. But you have to try, have to let people in even if it's risky, because ruling alone isn't sustainable. You'll burn out or make a mistake that could have been prevented, or just slowly turn into the kind of isolated, paranoid leader you fought so hard to remove. He was right. Celine hated that he was right, but recognizing truth was different from knowing how to act on it. How did you rebuild trust after it had been weaponized against you? How did you open yourself to people when the last time you'd done that, it had almost destroyed you? She didn't have answers. Just more questions that kept her awake at night while the Empire demanded decisions she wasn't sure she was qualified to make. 6 months after Darius's exile, a messenger arrived from beyond the northern border with a single letter bearing no seal or signature. Just words written in handwriting Celine recognized immediately. The letter said, "I built a house near the mountains, small, quiet. Nothing like the palace, but it's mine in ways that throne never was. I think about you sometimes. About the life we could have had if we'd been different people. But we weren't different people. We were exactly who we were, and that meant this ending was the only one that made sense. I hope you're finding peace in your victory. I hope the Empire treats you better than it treated me. And I hope someday you can forgive yourself for whatever you think you did wrong. Because from where I'm standing, you did everything right. You survived. That's the only victory that matters." There was no signature, no return address. Just those words and the weight of everything they implied. Celine read the letter 3 times, then burned it in the fireplace because some things were too dangerous to keep. But the words stayed with her, settled into the spaces between her thoughts, and reminded her that surviving wasn't the same as healing, that victory could feel like loss if you let it, that the war might be over, but the aftermath lasted forever, and you had to decide every single day whether you'd let it define you or just be something that happened on the way to becoming whoever you were supposed to be. She chose the latter. It was harder, meant confronting all the ways she'd changed, all the things she'd done that she couldn't undo, all the people she'd lost and the parts of herself that had died in that basement and would never come back. But it also meant possibility, the chance to build something better than what had existed before, to use the power she'd fought for to actually help people instead of just protecting her own position. To prove that someone could go through hell and come out the other side still believing in the possibility of doing good, even when the world made it desperately hard. A year after the trial, Celine stood on the palace balcony overlooking the capital at sunset. The city spread out below her in golden light, thousands of lives continuing in the ways lives did. People working and loving and struggling and surviving. The empire she'd fought to save and was still fighting to improve. Kaelin joined her after a few minutes of silence, stood beside her watching the same view. The council approved the education reforms. His voice was neutral. 5 new schools in the territories that have never had formal education access. It's a start. It's more than a start. It's a statement. Celine kept her eyes on the city, that we value people over profit, that power can be used for something other than maintaining power. "You're an idealist," Kaelin sounded almost amused. "I never would have guessed under all that ruthless pragmatism. I'm a realist who refuses to give up on the possibility that things can be better." Celine glanced at him. "There's a difference, is there? Because from where I'm standing, they look pretty similar." "Maybe, but one keeps me getting up every morning despite knowing I'll never fix everything. The other would have let me give up after that basement. Fair point." Kaelin was quiet for a moment. "He's alive, you know. Darius, word from the Northern Territories is he's running a trading company. Keeps to himself. Doesn't cause trouble. Good." Celine felt something complicated twist in her chest. "I hope he finds peace." "Do you really?" "I don't know." Celine turned away from the view. "But I hope I find it. That's enough to focus on." She went inside and left Kaelin on the balcony staring at the sunset. Inside there were reports to read and decisions to make, and the endless grinding work of holding an empire together one day at a time. But there was also the possibility that someday it would feel less heavy, that the weight she carried would become something she was strong enough to bear without it crushing her. That possibility was worth fighting for. 2 years after the trial, Celine finally took a full day off. Just 24 hours where she didn't attend council meetings or read reports or make decisions that affected thousands of lives. She spent it in the palace gardens, reading books that had nothing to do with politics, and eating food she actually tasted instead of consuming mechanically between meetings. It felt strange, almost wrong, like she was shirking responsibility. But Rhys had practically ordered her to take the time and threatened to lock her out of the war room if she didn't, so she'd grudgingly agreed. Halfway through the afternoon, she realized she was smiling. Actually smiling without it being performance or politics. Just genuine pleasure at the feeling of sun on her face and words on a page and the absence of pressure for a few precious hours. When was the last time she'd felt this? Before everything with Darius fell apart, probably. Before she'd had to become someone hard enough to survive betrayal and imprisonment and civil war. The woman who'd smiled easily seemed impossibly distant now, like someone else's memories instead of her own. But maybe that was okay. Maybe you weren't supposed to be the same person after surviving what she'd survived. Maybe the point wasn't getting back to who you were before. Maybe it was deciding who you wanted to become after and building that person deliberately instead of letting trauma do the building for you. Celine sat in the garden and made a decision. She wouldn't forget the darkness, wouldn't pretend it hadn't changed her, but she wouldn't let it be the only thing that defined her either. She'd survived. She'd won. Now she'd do something harder. She'd learn to live with what that had cost and try to build something beautiful anyway. 3 years after the trial, a delegation from the Western Territories arrived requesting an audience. They'd been isolated since House Voss's involvement in the conspiracy had come to light, cut off from trade and diplomatic relations as punishment. Now they wanted to negotiate re-entry into the Empire's good graces. The head of the delegation was a young woman with sharp eyes and careful manners who introduced herself as Lyra Voss. Not the same Lyra who'd manipulated Darius. This was a younger sister sent to clean up the mess her family had created. But the name still sent a cold spike of recognition through Celine's chest. They met in the formal throne room. Celine on her throne, wearing full regalia. Lyra standing in the petitioner's spot, wearing diplomatic gray and the expression of someone who knew they were navigating a minefield. Your family conspired against the crown. Helped orchestrate a coup that nearly destroyed the Empire. Celine kept her voice neutral. Give me one reason I shouldn't have you arrested the moment you leave this room. Because punishing me for my sister's crimes would be exactly the kind of tyranny she claimed the Empire engaged in. Lyra's voice was steady. And because House Voss has information about other conspiracies brewing in the Western Territories. Information we're willing to share in exchange for a path back to legitimacy. Information you'll use as leverage to avoid consequences. Celine leaned forward slightly. Why should I trust anything your house offers? You shouldn't. Lyra met her eyes directly. Trust is earned over time through consistent action. I'm not asking for trust. I'm asking for the opportunity to prove my house can be useful, that we can serve the Empire instead of undermining it. And if you're lying, if this is just another manipulation, then you execute me and eliminate House Voss completely. Lyra's expression didn't waver. I'm betting my life that you're smart enough to use people who wronged you instead of just destroying them, that you understand pragmatism better than vengeance. It was a good argument, also transparently calculated to appeal to Celine's documented preference for practical solutions over emotionally satisfying ones. She considered it for a long moment while the throne room waited in tense silence. Then she made her decision. House Voss will be allowed to re-enter trade relations on a probationary basis. You'll report directly to the Royal Council monthly. Any sign of conspiracy or betrayal, and the entire house is eliminated. Not exiled. Eliminated. Understood? Perfectly. Lyra inclined her head. Thank you, Your Majesty. Don't thank me. Prove you deserve the chance. After the delegation left, Kaelin appeared from the shadows where he'd been observing. That was risky. Giving House Voss any power after what they did. Everything's risky. Celine stood from the throne, but keeping them isolated turns them into a permanent enemy. Bringing them in under strict oversight turns them into a controlled asset. Risk either way. This path just has more upside. You're getting better at this. Kaelin sounded almost proud. The ruthless pragmatist thing. I learned from the best. Celine glanced at him. Even if he was a traitor. Kaelin laughed. Fair. 5 years after the trial, the Empire had stabilized in ways that seemed impossible during those first chaotic months. The reforms Celine had fought for were showing results. Education expanding. Infrastructure improving. The noble houses still jockeying for position, but within bounds that didn't threaten the realm's survival. It wasn't perfect, nowhere near perfect, but it was better. Tangibly, measurably better. And that felt like victory in ways winning battles never had. Celine stood in the throne room during the winter festival, watching hundreds of people celebrate with genuine joy instead of the careful performance they'd used during Darius's reign. She'd made this possible. Not alone, but her choices, her sacrifices, her refusal to break when breaking would have been so much easier. This was the legacy she'd built from the ruins of her marriage and the darkness of that basement. An empire that bent toward justice instead of just power. A realm where people could hope for better instead of just surviving. A future that wasn't guaranteed but was at least possible in ways it hadn't been before. Rhys approached through the crowd, his formal uniform crisp but his expression warm. "My lady, the council wants to know when you're planning to name an official heir. They're getting nervous about succession. Tell them I'm working on it." Celine kept watching the celebration. "And tell them to be patient. I'm not going anywhere. They worry you'll burn out. Work yourself to death trying to fix everything." "Then they don't know me very well." Celine glanced at him. "I've survived things that should have killed me. I'm not dying from overwork." Rhys smiled slightly. Stubbornness as survival strategy. Very on brand. It's worked so far. She meant it as a joke, but there was truth underneath. Stubbornness had kept her alive when cleverness failed. The sheer, bloody-minded refusal to give up had dragged her through darkness into light. That quality wasn't going anywhere. It was as much a part of her as breathing now. Later that night, alone in her chambers, Celine found herself thinking about Darius, wondering if he was watching the same moon from wherever he'd rebuilt his life, wondering if he ever thought about what they'd lost, if he regretted the choices that had led them to opposite sides of a civil war. She'd never know. That was part of accepting the ending, part of moving forward instead of staying trapped in the past. But she could admit, in the privacy of her own thoughts where nobody else could judge, that she missed him sometimes. Not the man he'd become. The man he'd been before power and paranoia had twisted him into someone capable of betrayal. The man she'd married believing they'd build something beautiful together. That man was gone. Maybe had never existed outside her imagination. But the grief for what might have been was real, even if the relationship hadn't been. Celine let herself feel that grief for exactly as long as it took the moon to move from one window to the next. Then she set it aside and went back to work. Because grief was a luxury, and she had an empire to run, and people depending on her to be strong enough to carry them all. 10 years after the trial, a historian requested an interview for a book about the Civil War and its aftermath. Celine agreed because controlling the narrative mattered, and she wanted the true story recorded instead of the legends that were already spreading. They met in her study over tea that went cold while they talked. The historian asked about the basement, about the chains and the darkness, and what it felt like to be imprisoned by someone who'd promised to love you forever. Celine considered her answer carefully. It felt like dying. Like every hour I spent there was stripping away pieces of who I'd been until I was just survival instinct and rage. But it also clarified things, showed me what I was really made of underneath all the performance and diplomacy. Turned out I was made of something that didn't know how to quit even when quitting was rational. The historian scribbled notes. And when you emerged, when you'd won, that's when it got harder. Celine smiled without humor. Fighting for your life is simple. You win or die. Building something after you've won requires believing the fight was worth it. Requires looking at all the damage and destruction and asking if the cost was justified. That's the question that keeps me awake at night even now. Was it justified? Celine was quiet for a long time before answering. I don't know. Ask me in another 10 years. Maybe by then I'll have done enough good to balance the scales. Or maybe I'll realize some costs can't be balanced, and I'll have to live with that. The book was published a year later with the title, The Chained Empress, Power, Betrayal, and the Price of Justice. It became required reading in the educational institutions Celine had established. Students studied her decisions and debated whether her choices had been right or necessary or something more complicated. Celine never read it, didn't need to. She'd lived it. That was enough. 15 years after the trial, Celine stood on the same balcony where she'd watched Darius's escort disappear beyond the northern border. The capital had grown. The empire had stabilized. The reforms had taken root so deeply that reversing them would have required another civil war nobody wanted. She'd done it. Built something that would outlast her, something better than what had existed before. The weight of the crown felt lighter now. Or maybe she'd just gotten stronger. Hard to tell the difference after carrying something heavy for long enough. Kalen had died 3 years ago. Natural causes. His son had taken over as heir and primary advisor and was doing a competent job of managing the noble houses without trying to overthrow her. That was progress. Reese was still alive, still commanding the guard, still checking on her with the gruff affection of someone who'd seen her at her worst and hadn't abandoned her. That was loyalty. The real kind. Earned and tested and proven through time. Lyra Voss, the younger sister, had become one of her most effective advisors. Turned out when you gave people a chance to prove themselves instead of just condemning them for their family's crimes, sometimes they rose to the occasion. Not always, but often enough to make the risk worthwhile. The empire was stronger than it had been in decades. More just, more stable, more concerned with the welfare of its people instead of just the power of its rulers. And Celine was tired. Not the exhausted desperation of those early years, just the deep bone weariness of someone who'd carried weight for too long and was ready to set it down. She'd been thinking about succession, about naming an heir and stepping back from active rule, becoming an advisor instead of the final authority, living for herself instead of for an empire that would continue with or without her. The thought terrified her. Power had been her identity for so long that she didn't know who she was without it. But maybe that was exactly why she needed to let go. Because holding on to power too long turned you into the thing you'd fought against, made you into someone who ruled from fear of losing control instead of genuine belief you were the best option. Celine didn't want to become that person, didn't want to wake up one day and realize she'd turned into another Darius, so afraid of losing power that she'd destroyed everything to keep it. Better to step back while she still remembered why power mattered in the first place, while she could still walk away instead of being carried out. She made the announcement 6 months later during the spring festival, named her chosen successor, a brilliant administrator from a minor house who'd proven themselves through years of competent service, set a timeline for transition, laid out the structure that would maintain stability through the change in leadership. The empire absorbed the news with surprising calm, maybe because they trusted her judgment, maybe because they were ready for something new. Maybe because 15 years of steady leadership had built enough institutional strength that individuals mattered less than systems. Celine stepped down on a clear morning when the light hit the palace just right and made everything look possible. She handed over the crown and the seals of office and the weight of responsibility she'd carried since that day in the throne room when she'd declared war on her own husband. Then she walked out of the palace as a private citizen for the first time in 2 decades. It felt strange. Terrifying. Free. She bought a small house in the mountains far from the capital, near where Darius had supposedly built his own refuge all those years ago, though she never sought him out. Some distances were meant to stay distant. She spent her days reading and thinking and slowly remembering how to exist without crisis, demanding her attention every waking moment. Wrote occasional letters to the capital offering advice when asked. Received visitors who wanted to hear the stories firsthand from the woman who'd lived them. Built a life that was hers alone instead of belonging to an empire, and discovered to her surprise that she was happy. Not the explosive joy of victory, just the quiet contentment of someone who'd fought their wars and survived and earned the right to rest. 20 years after the trial, an old man appeared at her door claiming to be Darius Thorne. He looked nothing like the king she'd married. Gray hair, weathered face, hands rough from manual labor, but the eyes were the same, gold-flecked and weary, and carrying the weight of everything they'd done to each other. "I heard you stepped down." His voice was rougher but recognizable. "Thought I'd risk the journey to see if it was true." "It's true." Celine didn't invite him inside, just stood in the doorway studying this ghost from her past. "Why are you here?" "To apologize." Properly this time. Not for tactics or methods, but for forgetting you were a person instead of a problem to solve, for letting power matter more than partnership, for all the ways I failed you. Apology noted. Celine kept her voice neutral. "Anything else?" Darius smiled slightly. "Maybe to see if you'd forgive me, though I'd understand if you didn't." Celine thought about it, about forgiveness and what it meant. Whether it was something you gave because someone deserved it, or because carrying the anger was too heavy anymore. "I don't forgive you." The words came out steady. "What you did broke something that can't be fixed with apologies. But I don't hate you either. You're just someone who used to be important who isn't anymore. That's as close to peace as we're getting. Darius nodded like he'd expected that answer. Fair enough. He turned to leave, then paused. For what it's worth, the Empire's better under your successor than it ever was under me. You did good work, Celine. Whatever else happened between us, you did good work. He left before she could respond. Celine stood in her doorway, watching him disappear down the mountain path, and felt something inside her chest finally let go. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, just the acceptance that some chapters ended without resolution, and that was okay. You didn't need closure to move forward. You just needed to decide the past didn't get to control your future anymore. She went inside and closed the door and got back to the life she'd built for herself in the aftermath of everything that had tried to destroy her. The life where she was just Celine. Not Empress. Not revolutionary. Not the woman who'd survived betrayal and imprisonment and civil war. Just someone who'd lived through difficult things and come out the other side still capable of joy and hope and the belief that tomorrow might be better than today. That was enough. That was everything. The empire she'd fought for continued without her, thrived in ways that proved she'd built something stronger than her own presence. The reforms took root. The systems held. The people prospered. And somewhere in the mountains, a woman who'd once worn a crown sat in her garden reading poetry and feeling the sun on her face and remembering that survival wasn't the destination. Living was. Actually living. Not just enduring or fighting or sacrificing everything for duty. Living with curiosity and pleasure and the small daily joys that made existence beautiful instead of just bearable. Celine Vale had spent her youth preparing to rule, spent her marriage fighting to maintain power, spent her middle years rebuilding an empire from the ruins of betrayal. Now, finally, she spent her days learning to be human again, learning to exist without armor, learning to trust that she'd done enough and could rest without guilt, learning that the strongest thing she'd ever done wasn't surviving the darkness or winning the war or holding the empire together through sheer force of will. It was choosing to walk away from power while she still remembered why it mattered. It was deciding that her life belonged to her instead of to the endless demands of a realm that would consume her if she let it. It was understanding that legacy wasn't about how long you held power, but what you left behind when you finally let go. And what Celine left behind was an empire that had learned to value justice over strength. Systems that protected people instead of just controlling them. A future that was brighter because she'd refused to let betrayal and darkness define her completely. That was the victory that mattered, not the throne room confrontation or the trial or the moment Darius fell, but the quiet decades after where she'd proven that someone could go through hell and still choose to build heaven for the people who came after. The sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in colors that had no names. Celine watched it from her garden and felt gratitude for everything. The struggle, the survival, the hard-won peace she'd earned through blood and tears, and the refusal to quit when quitting would have been easier. She'd been an empress once, a title she'd fought for and bled for and nearly died for. Now she was just a woman in a garden watching the sunset. And somehow, impossibly, that was more than enough. It was everything.